Hey everyone, I'm glad that we're going to be joined by Marty Sieff today. We've had a series of incredible presentations dealing with the underappreciated dynamics shaping history and our current predicament, which involves a deep dive into the underappreciated American system. Many classes from Lincoln, Hamilton's battle against Aaron Burr, the origins of Wall Street, the origins of the deep state, and then Madeline Derrien delivered an incredible two-part lecture series going through not just the artificial origins of Teutonic Aryan garbage, which contaminated so much of the intelligentsia and general society, both in the United States, the British Empire more broadly, and even later on in Germany, that we saw to disastrous effects during the 20th century. But then how that in her second class, she went into how that was directly responsible for the conversion of the USA, especially under Teddy Roosevelt, into an imperial beast, a monstrosity. So that was an incredible two-part series that added, I thought, a lot of coloring to the tapestry. Marty, about 7 weeks ago, had delivered an incredible presentation on Lord Palmerston, the man who raped the world, to just get across the pedigree of what is this imperial monstrosity that the American founding fathers broke away from. And what is it that was really behind the transformation of the U.S. into an empire in many ways? I mean, Teddy Roosevelt did enmesh the United States into this Anglo-American special relationship in at least the first version of it in the early part of the 20th century. So I thought that was of high value, and Marty has just contributed so much to the discourse, the dialogues after Madeline's classes that we had a conversation, and I just asked him, "Hey, you want to continue this stream of gestalt of thought into the 20th century, as far as recapitulating some of the ideas of what Teddy Roosevelt represented, these monstrosity of ideas, and then also how that shaped the U.S. Jump into hell in the Pacific, and just the current configuration today, which has seen the U.S. military establish a deep encirclement of China in the Pacific front, which involves something that could involve unleashing World War III if we're not very careful. So how did that happen? What can be done to break out of this toxic paradigm? And Marty, of course, agreed. So today, like usual, Marty's going to go through his main presentation. Afterwards, we're going to open up for some dialogue, and just leave your name in the chat box. I'll call upon you accordingly. And Marty, thank you so much for doing this. It's all yours.
Thank you, Matt. First of all, as Matt has already pointed out, this is a sequel, and really it's the part 3 to Madeline's masterful two-part series. It really is the part 3, because I thought before and discussed in a more informal way with Matt about doing the lecture on the US and the Pacific and the problems it led to. And the more I looked at it, the huger the problem became. But it was only learning from Magdalena over the previous 2 weeks, that I realized the nature, which she, of course, explored in very careful, scholarly, thorough, profound, and enormously enlightening detail of the nature of the poisonous tree. Now, there is a very famous legal term, you even find it used by Earl Stanley Gardner in the old Perry Mason stories and TV shows, roots of the poisonous tree, fruits of the poisonous tree, which basically say if you have tainted evidence, everything that flows, or a flawed source, or a source or an eyewitness that has been discredited, then every piece of conclusion, every piece of inference or assumption that comes from that source must be thrown out or questioned anew, because it is tainted. It is a fruit of the poisonous tree. Now, the fruits of our poisonous tree are obvious over the past century, and that is what I'm going to be going through. And there are even more of them than we realize. Not only is the issue but where does it come from? It comes from what Magdalena, bless her, traced for us and documented for us in the previous 2 lectures that she so masterfully gave. from Theodore Roosevelt and his associates, and the assumption of American racial superiority over the world to the far west across the Pacific, reaching to the east. In fact, now, there are several. We start exactly where Magdalena left off. We start with Theodore Roosevelt when he is still alive, because he is central to this. Because Roosevelt extends to the West the same assumptions and dreams and offensives of white Anglo-Saxon racism and economic exploitation of the world that Lord Palmerston and the British Empire and Winston Churchill after them extended to the East. The British Empire extended to India, the American and destroyed China and enslaved China too. The American visionaries wanted to get into China on Britain's back and create their own empire of eternity in Asia. And what is fascinating is, to start with, that there was no economic need for this. There was no significant economic gain from this, except to a handful of billionaires, and not even the biggest or most successful billionaires. Where did American billionaires make their money? They made it, first of all, in the domestic American market in the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century. And then they made it in Europe, especially in business deals with the Germans and the economic attempts to economically exploit Eurasia. And they made it in the Middle East, when they stumbled more by good luck than judgment on the enormous oil wealth of Saudi Arabia, after Winston Churchill, in yet another piece of his extraordinary masterful bunglings, and we will go into others of them en passant in this lecture today, but Churchill was eager to grab the oil wealth, which was enormous, of Iraq, and he suspected there was oil wealth in Arabia, and he backed the wrong team in Arabia. He backed the Hashemites, who were jerks, and he ignored the real Arab leaders of national liberation, who were the Saudis, with the fundamentalist movement of the time. So in the end, the Saudis, like the Irish before them and the Indians after them, learned very well not to trust perfidious Albion. And when America offered to, the big American oil companies offered to help develop their wealth, they grabbed it with both hands. And America made huge wealth from Arabia. But what wealth did America make from its empire in the Pacific? Can anyone tell me? Even if I don't stop to hear... yes, Pete, go ahead.
Well, at the after a time, they did garner some wealth from the Philippine Islands, however, and perhaps from Guam. I do think that and then Hawaii was certainly an agricultural, profitable place. Other than that, I'm not quite sure. Once the Panama Canal opened up in 1915, then it became rather influential, or more influential in the Pacific.
Well, yes and no. You're right, it did. And this was, as you say, it is in all the history textbooks, and T.O. is explicit about this, that the Panama Canal was planned for empire through Asia. But look at the examples you have just given. Hawaii. I've been there, I'm sure many of you have. Lovely island, wonderful resort. A pinprick. Is there gold? No. Is there silver? No. Is there oil? No. Are there rare earths? No. No. It's wonderful golf courses. Wow. Guam is less. Anyone here been to Guam? I've been to Guam. Anyone else been to Guam? What is there on Guam? Pete, go ahead again. Sure.
Thanks, Martin. Guam is comparatively small. It benefits only from its geography. It was 1,600 miles from the Philippine Islands. It was the first port of call east of the Philippine Islands for the the Spanish Empire. Their major port was Umatac in the south. The capital is Agana on that beautiful harbor and bay there. So it has the benefit of being where it is more than anything else, because there is no industry, there is very little agriculture, and as I understand it, there are about 137,000 people on Guam. So add to the Marianas Islands to the north, and it has value just for being there by and large.
Now think what you have just said, and look at the implications of it. Britain has India. Britain has also enslaved China. In the 1930s, America belatedly starts develop the American oil companies, not even American government. America has all the oil it can possibly need from Texas, which is the largest and most cheapest and most significant producer in the world, bigger than Oklahoma, bigger than Iraq, bigger than the entire Middle East. In World War II, the British oil machine does not run on oil from Iraq. It runs on oil from Texas. How much oil does America get from Guam or from Kauai? Nothing, of course. Nothing. And as for the Philippines, pineapples, anyone? And there is nothing in the Philippines except the delusion of empire and glory. You've taken over the Spanish Empire. Yay! But the Spanish used their empire sensibly, as we will see by contrast with the Americans. We did not. Tior, as usual, is chasing a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. He's chasing butterflies, like he did in the Amazon jungle and across Central Africa when he made a fool of himself repeatedly and destroyed what was left of his health after stepping down from the presidency in 1908. January 1909. There is nothing there. It is a delusion. But seeds have been sown for the future. And even worse, enemies have been made and commitments have been made. Because the United States took over the Philippines in 1898 to 1900, and President McKinley did not want to do it, but as Magdalena, as you so masterfully documented last week, President McKinley gets a bad rap for doing it. He's manipulated into doing it by a conspiracy led by Henry Cabot Lodge with his loyal right-hand man and dim puppet master Theodore Roosevelt, who is placed in, and of course, as you pointed out, Commodore Future Admiral George Dewey, sinking the poor obsolete Spanish fleet at leisure in a shooting gallery in Manila Bay. You may fire when ready, Mr. Gridley. As you said, that's one of the few lines I learned from when I was exposed by a wonderful teacher to the study of Eastern Asian history at the beginning of the 20th century back in Oxford. You may fire when ready, Mr. Gridley, and Mr. Gridley did. But what were the consequences of this? First, as you pointed out, the Filipinos had fought for their own liberation. They had fought under, as you rightly pointed out, a Garibaldi. And I had never thought of Aguinaldo as a Garibaldi till you documented it so vividly. And of course, you didn't just documented it. You showed the pictures. And what does he look like? He looks like one of these ghastly, self-promoting 19th century, oh boy, goody, look at me, I'm a little boy's hero, ready to liberate the world my way and inflict genocide and suffering and slaughter and poverty on hundreds of millions of people, whether they want it or not. Aren't I wonderful? Aguinaldo. He was another Garibaldi. And what were the results of Aguinaldo's self-glorification? Well, of course, when the Americans came in to liberate, their idea of liberating under Tior was to stay. And the Filipino nationalists, as you pointed out, did not want that. And they fought against it. And while the war with the Spanish, who were tired of empire that far away from Spain, halfway around the world from Spain, And basically, they just lived, the handful of imperialists who lived there lived there. They weren't even exploiting Spain officially from a Spanish point of view. They were there, the Philippines was their home. And the culture was Spanish. And the people had reasonably happily adapted to that. And the Spanish, as they did in later centuries, were relatively tolerant and adaptive to the many different peoples across the Philippine archipelago. But when America came in, all of a sudden, there's a new, energetic, efficient, Anglo-Saxon, demanding, ruthless empire coming in. And the Filipinos don't want it. And they made the terrible mistake that people still make around the world to this day, and that Woodrow Wilson inflicted on all of Europe, and as we shall see, much of Asia as well, after 19. That national self-determination, first of all, was sane and sensible and workable, which it has never been anywhere. Point one, the nation state works. The idea of splintering nation states and empires into so that in theory, every little ethnic group is free, never works. What happens is what I have quoted before, and I quoted in my Palmerston lecture from my old teacher, the great political philosopher and philosopher of history, Isaiah Berlin in Oxford. Freedom for the pike, for the big predator fish, is different from freedom from the sardine, the little feeder fish which we all know. Freedom for us sardines is freedom from being eaten by the big fish. We are protected from it. Freedom for the big fish is to eat all the little fish it can. Teddy Roosevelt, personally a wimp, a little fish, as the great Gore Vidal pointed out, overcompensated and conned himself into imagining he was a big fish. And for 125 years, every American imperialist and delusional idiot has believed T.R. at his own estimation. I never knew. Well, a crucial point you documented and reveal, Magdalena, which is that all the great pictures of Teddy Roosevelt as the great Western pioneer were taken by the dandy posing in a midtown Manhattan studio for pictures. The first greatest publicist in American history, which of course he was recognized as being for a long time before, but even that was a lie. Even that was a lie. So freedom for the Filipino people was a lie too. And when they made the very bad mistake of taking up Teddy Roosevelt on his lie, that the war of 1898 had been waged to free them, this was America's first moment of destiny, its first moment of determined jutting out the jaw, George W. Bush challenge, make America great again in the Middle East. Well, in the Far East. They crushed them. 8 million people living in the Philippine Islands. As you pointed out, Magdalena, 200,000 of them were killed, and many more died from the hardship imposed upon them by the repression of the American army, by the murderous, ruthless, genocidal scale. 40,000 Gazans are reported reasonably reliably, I think, of having died under the Israeli bombardment after the Hamas attack in retaliation for it over the last year and a half. 40,000 out of a population of 2 million is very bad. Figure may well be higher. But whoever mentions, as you pointed out, Magdalena, the 200,000, and it was probably higher, dead we crushed in the Philippines in the first decade of the 20th century. And the man who was responsible supposedly for ending the slaughter, but actually continued it very efficiently, and took the embarrassing headlines away from Teddy Roosevelt, were his right-hand man, who he then promoted to be Secretary of War and eventually his successor, one of the most powerful and acclaimed figures in American history, President Taft. Now, President Taft, huge 350-pound guy, he was such a close friend of T.R.'s that he even allowed T.R. to beat him up I mean, of course, he could have crushed tiny little Tior in a second, but Taft was one of these very significant people it's a mistake to underestimate. He seemed to be sweet and kindly, but he happily presided over genocide and didn't prosecute anybody except for a couple of ludicrous lower level officials and show trials for it. And he becomes Secretary for War, and then he becomes President of the United States. And then T.R. tries to take the presidency back from Taft. Bad mistake. History is full of such examples. You could even say Brutus for Julius Caesar is one. The historical Brutus, that is, as opposed to Shakespeare Marlowe's noble version of it. The loyal number two who gets beaten around and despised by number one for far too often, and eventually the worm turns. My heroine, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, made that mistake with Geoffrey Howe, who was her take no prisoners, beat inflation at all costs, restabilize the economy, even though it costs 4 million unemployed out of a population of 60 million, equivalent of 16 million unemployed today. You can't imagine any American president, including President Trump, putting up with it. But Thatcher did. She was tough and she was ruthless and she was determined. And she did have a will of steel. And unlike Teddy Roosevelt, who, if anything, was smaller than she had the nerve and the guts to go through with it. They didn't call her the Iron Lady for nothing. Otto von Bismarck was Germany's Iron Chancellor. Margaret Thatcher, wielding her handbag, was the Iron Lady. She didn't give herself that name. The Soviet government, the Soviet Union, gave her that name. It was well deserved. But she had a right-hand man in Geoffrey Howe, her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister, and then her Foreign Minister, who she treated like dirt, who she despised. And eventually, in rage, when she fired him and humiliated him for the last time in 1990, he turned on her, joined her political enemies in Parliament, and ravaged her in one of the most scathing speeches, which nobody had thought him capable of. And down the Iron Lady fell after a record 11 years as Prime Minister. Teddy Roosevelt made the same mistake with Taft. He wanted Taft to step down from the presidency in 1912, and so he could take over again. But T.R. had been a joke as President of the United States. He'd alarmed Wall Street. He'd endangered American prosperity, which had been handed to him on a plate by his assassinated predecessor, President William McKinley, in the 1900s. And it took the direct intervention of Wall Street and the reimposition of Wall Street power under that most sinister figure, the arch banker. And I have a mental block of this thing. Will you give it to me, someone? The big guy, Mr. Evil.
J.P. Morgan.
Yes, thank you. Exactly. That's age for you. J.P. Morgan. And everybody talks about how T.R. rolled back the trusts. He did not. He failed to break up Standard Oil. And he bungled the economy so badly that Morgan had to step in with his personal guarantees and reestablish his dominant banking financial control over the entire United States in 1907 to end the financial crisis of 1907 because T.R. had bungled it. By contrast, Taft maintains the confidence of Wall Street, maintains the confidence of the bankers, including J.P. Morgan. I say the name before I forget it again, which I'm sure I will. And he does something else. He breaks up Standard Oil. The crucial prosecution to break up Standard Oil is carried through over a 3 and 4 year period under Taft and not under T.R. And Taft rightly gets the credit for doing it. No, there's no revolution here. When John D. Rockefeller gets the news that his empire, the greatest financial and economic and energy empire in the history of the human race, has just been broken up, he's playing a round of golf, and very well. And he isn't worried. And he simply says to the friend he is golfing with, lucky friend, obviously a multimillionaire too, if you're in John D. Rockefeller's good favor in 1908 or 1910, right? He says to him, "My dear fellow, all it means is I shall be worth twice as much next year." And he wasn't joking. Unlike T.R., when John D. Rockefeller spoke, he had the power and brains to make it happen. And a family trait that continued to the next 2 or 3 generations. As most of us know, David Rockefeller, the last of his grandsons, only died a couple of years ago at the age of 104, I believe it was. I stand to be corrected on the exact date. Right? But that is power. You make a prophecy and you know it will come true because you make it come true. Most reliable way to be a reliable prophet. You make it come true. But nevertheless, Standard Oil had been broken up, and the direct power nexus of concentration of power in a single man and a single company had been dissolved and loosened. And Teddy Roosevelt was jealous. So he comes storming back in 1912 to try and take the presidency back from Taft. He splits the Republican Party, and Woodrow Wilson, an even greater catastrophe, takes over, but another white racist, like T.R. himself, to keep the great tradition going, comes in. But, so we have had the first unintended consequence of T.R.'s vision of empire in Asia. Genocide and the slaughter of at least 200,000 innocent people in the Philippines who did not want to be kept part of the American empire. Right? But there is another unanticipated consequence that goes with it. Korea is destroyed and enslaved too. Because T.R., the great strategic genius, right, the neocon of his day, the Paul Wolfowitz of his day, the John Bolton of his day, the genius, has forgotten that Japan is there. And Japan has developed its own impressive navy. And by 1904, Japan is confident enough to invade the mainland of Asia itself, to carve out an empire in China, and to take on the largest land power in the world, which is Tsarist Russia, and beat them. Right? And also, even if America had the power and the political will and the concentration of naval power to beat Japan, and it does not, there is another problem. Japan, since 1900, 1901, has been 1902, has been a treaty ally of the greatest power in the world and the greatest navy in the world, Britain, the Anglo-Japanese Treaty for 20 years. And because, now you see the problem this gives T.R., because he wants to create a world empire and make America the blood brother, the little brother happily going up there of the British Empire. Now, as I've said before, British policy since Suez in 1956, and this was explained to me by one of the top policy advisors to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Brilliant conceptual idea, very sophisticated. America is the Lone Ranger, and Britain must be America's Tonto, its loyal ally. Now, of course, it's a lot more than that. The City of London, to this audience, of course, I do not need to say, is not the tail that wags the dog. It is the dog that wags the tail, with America as the tail much more often than the other way around. But for at least public consumption, and when sheer physical force and resources are involved, America tries to influence Britain and tell it what to do. But for this, America must at least appear to be in public, always to be riding alongside the Lone Ranger. Trouble is, if you're the Lone Ranger and it's the real world, it doesn't take much to shoot you. A single rifle bullet will do it. To be alone in the world and try and impose your power on the world is a very dangerous thing to do. I pointed this out very unfashionably, and of course got my head handed to me on a plate yet again. But then they would have the neocons would have guillotined me 100 times over the past 30 or 40 years if they had the chance. Glad you're dead, Robespierre, right? But you have your heirs. Because I pointed out the error of Madeleine Albright, herself a Czech, Russia-hating, she was actually Jewish, but tried to pretend not to be. Everything about her, like Joan Curry and others, was a fake and a lie. The genius Secretary of State, while Zbigniew Brzezinski pulled her strings, she calls America the indispensable nation. And what's the problem with being an indispensable nation? Everybody else wants you to be dispensable. You make enemies. If you, Jerry, I read your work on this. Of course, it's one of your lifelong themes. Magdalena, again, you've got that. I've drawn an inside straight or a royal flush look on your face again. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Exactly. And this is the position T.O. wanted for America and put it in, which meant he had to deal with Japan. But Japan was determined and obsessed to occupy Korea. The Japanese obsession with occupying and, when necessary, inflicting unfortunate but always necessary genocidal violence on Korea goes back 400 years. That is still only half the time the British cut loose in Ireland, but it's bad enough. Since the 1880s, Japan has effectively run Korea, but indirectly. Korea is still technically, like Hawaii was, standing in the way of the United States when President McKinley tried, or as long as he lived, to protect the independence of Hawaii, and therefore had to be assassinated. Because, of course, for T.R. and Henry Cabot Lodge and their handful of co-conspirators, Hawaii was the gateway to imperial power in the Pacific. It was the Golden Gate out east, out due west, and it was. But as we shall see, the Golden Gate to what? To hundreds of thousands of needless American dead and scores of millions of needless Asian dead and suffering. That has been the pattern for 125 years. It starts with the Philippines, with the crushing of the Philippine people in 1900 to 1910, with Taft sitting over, presiding over, and cleaning up after the dirty work is done by the United States Army. And it then continues in when Taft is sent by TR on his famous ship trip, which my friend James Bradley, who you must get to speak to the group here, he's a wonderful man and a brilliant historian and utterly fearless and has done utterly groundbreaking work on this. And of course, one of his books, Flags of Our Fathers, was made into a masterful movie on the Battle of Iwo Jima and how the heroes of Iwo Jima were shamefully manipulated and used as soon as they came home. And the movie was made by Clint Eastwood himself, right? So definitely get James to speak to this group. And we are email pen pals and mutually supportive friends, so feel free to cite me to him. But James has pointed out the fateful, sinister significance of the trip that T.R. sent his right-hand man, Secretary Taft, and his own brilliant, evil, dark daughter, Alice, future long-time lover and mistress of Senator Bora, who in his day was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for an entire generation. There is continuing power for you. And therefore Alice only loses her real lethal power in Washington when Bora dies of natural causes, he is very old, in 1940. But what is the quid pro quo for America staying in the Philippines? When even then Japan could take it from them and the Philippines are indefensible so far from America? It is, and it is made clear by Prince Saionji and his brilliant generation of Japanese diplomats around the Meiji Emperor. It is very simple. It is that the United States acquiesce and support the rise of Japan in the East. And this, first of all, means giving Japan everything it needs at the expense of Russia, in the negotiations which are held on American soil and for which T.R. is outrageously awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American ever to get it, after the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. But secondly, it means that for America to rest secure in the Philippines and Japan to leave them alone, Korea must be allowed to be taken over and raped literally mercilessly, as we shall see, literally mercilessly, because what happens to the Korean people? Korean men are reduced to being torturers for Imperial Japan. And even in World War II, Western, British, American, and Australian prisoners are treated more cruelly by Korean guards than they are by the Japanese overlords, because the guards themselves have been brutalized by the Japanese racist conquerors. But it is the Korean women who bear the great brunt of this, and this remains the major source of hatred towards Japan and suspicion towards Japan in democratic, prosperous, otherwise admirable South Korea to this day. The heritage of all the women who became field whores for the Japanese army for 3 full generations from the beginning of the 20th century through the murderous assassination, I believe she is cut down by a sword in her own palace, of the Queen Empress of Korea, when Japan finally isn't satisfied with pulling the strings behind the scenes, and Korea is absorbed into the Japanese empire in the merciless way. The Japanese are not always merciless. Their rule for half a century in Taiwan from 1895 to 1945 protects Taiwan from all the horrors that are both self-inflicted and inflicted by other nations, including Japan, on the mainland people of China through all that time. And Japanese rule is also extremely enlightened and tolerant and supportive of national liberation movements in what is now Indonesia, or what we should more accurately call the Javanese Empire, especially in the island of Java when they occupy it in World War II. They are seen, and rightly so, as an enormous relief and liberation after 350 years of merciless Dutch colonialist exploitation. They are. And when the Japanese army under General Yamashita is striking through Malaya to capture Singapore, their attitude towards the Malayan Peninsula people themselves is merciless. And towards the Chinese, far in Singapore, it's so far worse. But the Britain's loyal Indian army, quote unquote, in Singapore cannot stand the English. There are 45,000 Indian soldiers serving with the British in Singapore at the beginning of 1942. They all surrendered to the Japanese without a fight. 40,000 of the 45,000 immediately volunteer to serve under Chandra Bose in the Indian Army of Liberation to invade India to free it from the British, which Gandhi himself, that great champion of nonviolence, has called upon them to do. And incidentally, Matt, as if we don't have enough stories going on around here, I inflict upon you another story idea for the next time around, which is, and please everyone else remember it, Gandhi and Winston Churchill, parallel lives. Parallel lives. Gandhi, of course, succeeds on a colossal scale where Churchill fails. But he is not what he appears to be, or what the English foolishly imagine him to be. Gandhi is very much worth studying himself, but for his parallels with Winston Churchill, and they are not flattering ones, rather than the contrasts. Gandhi, of course, and the rise of Indian nationalism draws inspiration from Japan, and the fact that Japan is a trusted ally of the British for the first quarter of the 20th century, but therefore America must treat it with respect. So look what Teddy Roosevelt has done, the man of vision, the genius. Has he created a financial empire to rival those of the British or even the French in Africa? No, as Peter has pointed out. The best he could lay his hands on was pineapples, which you could already get from the Caribbean anyway, and the Dole Company, which Magdalena documented so vividly last week as building its empire on bananas and the enslavement of the peoples of Latin America, was already providing very efficiently to the breakfast tables of America from the Caribbean. You didn't need the Philippines for that. You actually didn't need them, and you had Hawaii, right? Which is also very small. So what is America getting in terms of profit from the Philippines? Without making this lecture even more outrageous to genteel English audiences, and therefore I will not spell out the term, but the meaning of the term is well known, they're getting SFA, sweet F expletive all. They are getting nothing from it. But they have made an enemy, and they know it. Japan. And they have a complication with the British because the British support Japan. And in World War I, at British urging, Japan honorably fulfills its treaty obligations with Britain and enters the war against Germany and protects the Eastern Empire of the British from any potential threat in return for what? Simply gobbling up Germany's interests in China and the islands of the Pacific Ocean. And that turns out to be very important indeed, because suddenly Japan is advancing a third of the way across the Pacific Ocean at the very same time, right after, within 20 years earlier, America was leaping across the Pacific Ocean, as Magdalena pointed out. They were already very much in Tahiti. They are already very much in Hawaii. They formally annex Hawaii and topple the Queen. They leap all the way to the Philippines. But now it's like a game of cosmic or global checkers, or drafts, as we called them when I grew up in Britain. You know, you leap over pieces to jump across the table. And now Japan is leaping across America's pieces and is taking all the German islands in the Central Pacific. And these islands will cost the lives of scores of thousands of well-trained, elite, brave American Marines soldiers during World War II, because they will be defended so tenaciously by the Japanese army against the Americans. And they are Japan's shield against America. And they also mean that any relief of the Philippines by the American Navy, as the great visionary genius Teddy Roosevelt expected, because after all, the Japanese are only a buck-toothed, bespectacled, short-sighted, ridiculous little underfed Asian people. What can they possibly do against the great, masterful, global, world-spanning Anglo-Saxon race? Right? Well, it turned out, as we shall see, and as you already know, they can do quite a lot. A very great deal indeed. And the United States Navy recognizes this. And although nobody else really pays attention, the rise of Japan in the Pacific is looked upon with ignorance and complacency by the imperial idiots in London and by the leaders in Canada, who have their own preoccupations and are still at the cost of scores of thousands of their own boys' lives, fed as cannon fodder on the Western Front in World War I. But two national leaderships look upon Japan's rise with realism, and they are both white Anglo-Saxon nations. And they have both risen on the genocide and slaughter of native peoples, and they are the United States of America, of course, and Australia. Australia, after World War I, has a very interesting prime minister called Billy Hughes. He's a working-class populist leader. He is as racist as they come towards everyone from Aborigines, the Aborigine people, all the way through to certainly no black people will be allowed in Australia, or any peoples of the Maori or Polynesian races, or from Hawaii, while Billy Hughes is running things. And no Japanese or Chinese will be allowed in, except to bring in some needed opium for the ruling and heroin for the ruling classes. I mean, there is good both entertainment but also education in this, in the wonderful Australian television series Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, set in Melbourne in the 1920s, which for both light relief but also significant enlightenment on a popular scale, I warmly recommend to this audience, to everyone for that matter. It's great fun. And S.E. Davis is quite wonderful as the star of it. But Billy Hughes is also a brilliant guy. And he recognizes the rise of Japan. And in 1921, coming to Britain, he tells the Imperial Conference, led by Lloyd George himself, with Lord Curzon, George Nathaniel Curzon on one side, Winston Churchill on the other, there is imperial brain power for you. Japan, you must renew the imperial alliance with Japan, because if Japan was on Germany's side, we would have lost the World War. Now, nobody in not Churchill and Lloyd George, these giant geniuses who have sent 1 million British boys to be killed outright and another 2 million to be crippled for life, turned into brain dead vegetables, or hopping around on one limb instead of four in the horrors of the Western Front. Take Japan that seriously. And Hughes has not gone to Eton or to Harrow as Churchill did. He hasn't gone to Oxford or Cambridge. He isn't polished. He's a yokel from the Australian outback, right? He grew up shaving sheep, right? That's the attitude. And the fact that Hughes speaks his mind and in clear language, as opposed to the elegant circumlocutions of hundreds of years of English sophistication and diplomacy, makes him even more contemptible. So Hughes is ignored. But he can't be completely, because there is another force pressing on Britain. It is the new, independently minded American government of President Warren Harding and his Secretary of State, Evans Hughes. Now, Hughes is a curious man. He's a former passionate supporter of Teddy Roosevelt. He's a great believer in Anglo-Saxon global power. And he is close to New York financial interests. He represented them. He became governor of New York State. He was the Republican candidate for the presidency in 1916 and loses by a hair's breadth in California. And as I have pointed out before here, again, this is something for many of the superb scholars here, for Jerry, Magdalena, Stephen, and if we can get the words to Anton and to Cynthia and to Matt, and to you, Manaka, and you, Monty, to look into. And that is, was the 1916 election stolen for Woodrow Wilson from the candidate who the British preferred, who they, at the time, they thought they preferred, but they learned otherwise afterwards, or maybe they were against him. But was the vote in California fixed in 1916? You can get away with anything if nobody dreams you are doing it. Nobody, as far as I know, has ever looked into the question of whether the vote in California specifically, which swung the result of the 1916 presidential election unexpectedly to the already rightly despised and distrusted Woodrow Wilson, who had reimposed racist Jim Crow laws and discrimination, purging black people from the American civil service, and whose quiet support was essential to the rise again of the Ku Klux Klan 40 years after General Ulysses S. Grant had mercilessly and correctly suppressed it back in the 1870s. We look on the Woodrow Wilson era, liberals regard him as a great hero because he increases the size of the national government. They don't look at what he actually did. The complete suppression on a scale not seen until the Patriot Act of George W. Bush of due process in law, of the Anglo-Saxon at its best legal system in the United States, in the Palmer raids and the Red Scurs of 1919 and 1920, which are ended by that evil supposed drunkard, another outrageous lie, Warren Harding, when Harding comes into power and reestablishes due process and the rule of law to the Department of Justice in the United States. Excuse me. Non-alcoholic, I assure you, at least for now. Now, the rise of Charles Evan Hughes comes back. He is appointed Secretary of State by Warren Harding. And Harding is following a policy of independence from the British Empire and American interests first. And of course, Harding tragically and unexpectedly dies in 1923. A discussion which we have had on previous occasions and which we may have separately again. It always bears coming back to. But while he is in office, he and Hughes do something epical that is never referred to in any ignorant American history textbook, and certainly not by the British either. He ends 350 years of independent global naval power over the world by the British Empire, going back to before the Spanish Armada. At the Washington Naval Conference of 1921, which is unilaterally called and imposed by Harding and Hughes. And when all the global delegates from the major naval powers get there, they find that the agenda has already been carefully drawn up for them with a precise timetable for when results have to be made from it. This is a level of discipline and diktat on a global international peace conference that has never been applied by anyone before, and is not applied by Woodrow Wilson or by Theodore Roosevelt. It is applied by that terrible, stupid, simple wimp, ignorant in the ways of global power, again, all lies, Warren Harding, and implemented for him by Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. Because Hughes has now unexpectedly emerged as an arch foe of the British Empire, as an arch foe of unlimited British power exercised around the world. And he has two goals. First, to end the era of, and he succeeds in them. First, to end the era of unlimited American global naval dominance, which, as we have seen in previous lectures, both from me and others, had threatened the very survival of the United States of America during the Civil War, until it was protected by the intervention of Tsar Alexander II, who sent Russian naval flotillas to New York City and to San Francisco as tripwires to protect the Union, to protect the United States of America from naval intervention and the bombardment and coastal destruction of America's great cities on both the east and west coasts by the Royal Navy, when the United States Navy hardly existed at the time, except to gain control, as we know, up the Mississippi River, which was not small, but is still a long way from command of the Atlantic Ocean, or the Pacific Ocean, for that matter. And at the Washington Naval Conference, Britain, with only a fraction of the industrial power of the United States, and now, because of Winston Churchill's personal dealings with Bernard Baruch, in order to get all the steel and munitions and heavy guns and armaments that England needed to win the battles on the Western Front with heavy artillery in World War I, with no thought to the future, Britain is now hugely in debt to the United States. And what does Charles Evans Hughes, Secretary of State, say to Britain's ambassador to Washington on their first major meeting after he takes power in 1921? It bears reading, it bears looking up. It is extraordinary. He says, "You are nothing," I paraphrase slightly, but look it up. I am not exaggerating here, and while I am paraphrasing, I am not misleading. "You are nothing without us. If we had not intervened on your behalf, you would be speaking German now." So much for the special relationship. And Woodrow Wilson himself, a repulsive jerk, who inflicts ignorant chaos on Europe and makes World War II inevitable and makes the bloodbaths we see as far as Ukraine and throughout the hatreds we see throughout Eastern Europe today are all a direct result of the Versailles Treaty and of the Versailles Peace Conference. All a direct result of that. But even Woodrow Wilson does not want to give the English a free hand. What Woodrow Wilson tells the British when he comes to England in 1919, and they give him the usual soft soap treatment: "We'll make you a Knight of the Garter, we'll invite you to Buckingham Palace, we'll have parades with mounted soldiers in your honour." Charlie Krauthammer and the neocons and all the idiot childish whores always fall for this treatment. Even Wilson did not. Even Wilson did not. Of course, he was God in his own mind, so, he didn't need the English gods to tell him he was God. But what he says to them is very revealing. "You think of us as your sister people. We are not. We are not just the Anglo-Saxon stock." And of course, he is a right racist. But he then says, "We came from all over Europe. We are German and French and Irish," and he draws the line at any unfortunately Catholic-speaking peoples, and of course Jews don't get a mention in there, and if you're black, well, forget about it, let alone Indian or Japanese. But at least among the white Protestant races, we're not just English. So don't pull this baloney on us that you're our sister people. You are not. You are alien to us. Even Woodrow Wilson says that. America is feeling its power after World War One, and they act upon it. And here we come back to the East and Japan, because there is no thought of giving up the Philippines. There is no money being made from it. It is a huge strategic delusion and distortion on American priorities. But it is ours, and we are a world power. And we, that is to say, the handful of idiots at the Naval War College in Annapolis and members of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., it all comes from them, from nobody else. It all comes from them and nobody else. You do not see any national movement across America to conquer the Pacific or enter Japan. None. And when we get to China, as we shortly shall, we shall see there are only two individuals, though they have enormous power, who raise the delusion that America must lead China by a leash or by the nose, but lovingly, of course, in the ways of a Protestant Christian compassion, Midwest style. And we will get to these geniuses just in a couple of minutes. But you see, it isn't the American people doing this. It isn't even American industry or American bankers doing this. It's a handful of delusional loons doing this. But Evans Hughes is not a loon. He goes on, after being Secretary of State, to being appointed by the Republicans as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he is the only major American leader and politician ever to beat Franklin Roosevelt outright on major policy issues, when he defeats the court-packing plan of 1937, when FDR is at the height of his power and has just been elected by a record landslide for his second term of office, and Charles Evans Hughes still beats him. That's how formidable Charles Evans Hughes is, but he has already ended British naval dominance of the world, and the basic naval and military foundation for the entire British Empire at the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 under Warren Harding. But he still wants to keep the Philippines, so he has to keep Japan sweet. So the Washington Naval Conference, first of all, comes up with a compromise between the three greatest naval powers in the world. The rest don't matter. Germany's navy has been captured by the British and scuttled by its own sailors at Scapa Flow in 1919 or 1920, after the end of the armistice at the end of World War I. The French navy, while excellent in quality, is small compared with the British. The Italian navy is growing and will always have excellent ships, but there is no maritime warrior tradition in Italy, as is dramatically demonstrated in World War II. And Russia is obsessed with its own issues, doesn't have a navy worth the name at all until the 1950s. So there are only three real players in town. The United States, challenging the British, who are number one, but cannot sustain it, and Japan at number three. And the Washington Naval Conference recognizes this, and the results are imposed by Hughes. It's the 5-5-3 formula. For every 5 capital ships, which eventually will come to include aircraft carriers, but then only means battleships, and are regarded basically as the only things that really count, though they aren't. Submarines are much more important, but this hasn't filtered through to the admirals and the political leaders yet. So everybody is still counting in simplistic terms. They are thinking in terms of battleships as metrics of global power and naval supremacy. Britain and America will both be the top dogs in the world, with 5 battleships, with an equivalent of 5 battleships, or 10 or 20, but they'll have parity at 5 equals 5. Japan will have 60%, be permitted to build to 60% of that level, which is more than the Japanese naval capability, shipbuilding capability is anyway at this point. So the Japanese are happy for this. It's more than it's like the Nazis settling for a similar concession from the British in 1935. Well, we'll happily compromise when actually we couldn't beat that. If we had to cheat and beat your level, of course we do it, but we don't have the capability to do even that. So we'll play the gentleman and look like we're nice liberal minders of League of Nations until international law and war is obsolete anyway. And they're happy to lie about this nonsense and pretend to believe it. And so they will build 3 capital ships for every 5 America and Britain has. But Britain has an empire spread all the way around the world. And the United States, even with the Panama Canal, has to defend major vulnerable coastlines 1,000 miles long, with 3 or 4 of its major cities on it on the East Coast and 3 or 4 more on the West Coast. So the American fleet will have to be divided anyway between the Pacific and the Atlantic. And a conflict, and certainly rivalry, between the British Empire and America is, to put it mildly, still very much conceivable. So the British and the Americans have to divide their power, and they're not really paying attention to Japan anyway. Only Billy Hughes in Australia is. So by giving Japan 60% of the naval capability that Britain has and America has, you're basically giving Japan superiority of the entire Western Pacific and all the way down as far as Malaya. And later British admirals in the 1920s recognized this. So they planned to build a port in Singapore, which the Americans don't care about. It's not their part of the world. A fortress that the British Navy can sail to and protect Britain's huge Eastern Empire from who? From Japan. China has still been enfeebled and enslaved more by Britain than by any other nation, with uncontrolled flow of opium through the 1920s. And while the nationalists and the communists are both rising in China, they are also tearing each other's guts out. So China is a huge market, and it's filled with chaos. But it certainly is not a power to project its threat even to Hong Kong, let alone all the way south to Malaya or east to the Philippines. Nobody cares about it. But the British finance minister in charge of British spending in the 1920s, and who is obsessed with cutting it even more than Elon Musk is in America today, is our old friend, Winston Churchill. And Churchill goes, like any self-respecting politician, goes through many lies and U-turns and reversals through the course of his career, and is a cynic. And in the 1920s, he is the Elon Musk of the British defence establishment. Except where Elon Musk has not cut a sweet cent from the Pentagon budget, and has not raised a finger to even threaten any of the 17 most expensive and useless programs, as my friend Andrew Coburn at Harper's Magazine has documented on his own Substack, and it's worth looking, anyone who wants to, and it's an important subject, should look up to on this. There are $60 billion to be saved in acting simply 17 programs which will not come online, if they ever do at all, for another 5 to 20 years in the United States defense industry. And Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, D-O-G-E, have not raised a finger to cut any of them. It's all a lie. And of course, Musk's fortune itself, which is at a wildly exaggerated level, placed at $300 billion, it's much the value of Tesla. It's actually infinitely less. But it's dependent ultimately on the $22 billion in real money that it is given every year by the United States government and taxpayer, including by Joe Biden. So the idea that Musk is a heroic figure fighting to roll back government socialism and government control and government investment, and especially the defense industry, is a lie that is simply swallowed by millions of right-wing, simplistic, free market loons in America. Well, again, Jenny, bless you, as usual, you're way ahead of me. Our telepathic link shows me this, that the way you're laughing uncontrollably. No surprise to you, of course. Now, by contrast, Churchill is serious about axing British military and naval power in the 1920s. And one thing he insists on is saving money on Singapore. He doesn't want to build a base at all. And when it's built, all he can imagine is building big, obsolete 15-inch guns pointing out to sea to scare off pirates in their catamarans. He doesn't see the need for any land-based defenses because Singapore will never be attacked from land, because the Malayan people are just black Asian coolies and nothing can be expected of them. And China is still mired in civil war, and well, obviously the Chinese are useless, and they deserve to all be enslaved by the British as drug addicts, which they have been since the 1840 and 1860 Opium Wars. And who does that leave? It leaves Japan, with their tiny little fleet, much of which originally was bought from the British anyway. But the Japanese are just the Japanese, and Churchill is a racist. And Churchill never takes the Japanese seriously. And he writes this in memoranda to the Imperial War Council and as Chancellor of the Exchequer and to the British Cabinet in the 1920s under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. War with Japan? Remember those imperious tones. They sound much better when Richard Burton says them in the television dramatization. War with Japan. Why it will never happen in my lifetime. What a maroon. And what does he say when Japan inflicts the greatest humiliation in the history of the British Empire and captures Singapore with less than 1/3 of the troops defending Singapore at the beginning of 1942? Why? Churchill tells the House of Commons why the idea that Singapore, no one ever told me, the idea that Singapore, our mighty fortress, always mighty fortress, it wasn't a fortress at all. It was a shipyard. That's all they built there, with a few guns sticking out. It wasn't a fortress. This mighty fortress was defenseless on its landward side. No one ever informed me of this. Another lie, because he was the one who personally ordered that no defences be built to protect Singapore on the landward side in order to save money in the 1920s, because the idea that anyone, most of all the Japanese, could actually land in Malaya and march down and walk into Singapore was inconceivable to the great prophetic genius. And again, Japan has been mobilized and has now been given a free hand to build to its maximum naval power in order for the Americans to buy peace from Japan to maintain the Philippines, even though there is no benefit to be taken from the Philippines. But of course, the tensions are rising. The American Navy is scared of Japan. And as early as the 1920s, they have drawn up Plan Orange. The operational plan to defeat the Japanese in the Pacific and eventually to starve the Japanese islands into submission, which is followed in every detail by Admiral Nimitz and the American naval power in World War II, after they had been attacked first. Then we shall see why they were attacked first. But again, it's the American delusion with Asia that has drawn them into conflict with Japan. And the naval experts in America see this coming, but nobody can do anything about it because nobody is ready to give up the Philippines. As early as the 1930s, they are ready to give the Filipinos de facto independent government. They are, and they do. And the American record in the 1930s and 40s is much better, infinitely superior to that of the British or any other colonial powers at that time in Europe in recognizing at least potential rights of emerging nationalisms. Infinitely better. They are learning a bit. But they insist on keeping their huge naval shipyards there because the curse of Admiral Mahon, which you, Magdalena, documented last week, and the curse of Teddy Roosevelt is still on them. They still imagine the delusion that, like the English, they need to keep imperial power all around the world, even when they have made no material benefit for their own stockholders or their own banks, let alone for the American people, from that power. But you're still going to keep it because Asia is the continent of the future, and we've got to rule the continent of the future. I had a wonderful professor of Middle East history, Iraqi, and Iraqi Jewish too, and a huge skeptic about the British Empire because he'd suffered under it. The late Eli Kaduri, professor of politics at the University of London. Among other things, he was one of the people who exposed the extraordinary delusion that Lawrence of Arabia mattered. when Lawrence of Arabia was just a poor, sad little pervert who impressed fools like Winston Churchill, but otherwise simply liked being whipped by his social inferiors. I mean, literally whipped, physically whipped. He was a twisted little jerk. Right? And the idea that he organizes this great Arab national revolt is a lie. There is a national Arab revolt, but it's against the British, not against the Turks and the Germans, and it's led by the Saudis. And they find support in the United States of America among both businessmen and Carey's heirs. And Woodrow Wilson recognizes, no, not Woodrow Wilson, of course not. Franklin Roosevelt recognizes the legitimacy of this when he meets King Ibn Saud of Egypt, which is still a British protectorate at the time, which outrages Churchill, of course, and further humiliates him, in 1945. The Americans recognize who the real national power in the Middle East is among the Arab peoples. The British, of course, never, ever do. They never do. But what we find, therefore, is here in the East, the British at least established their naval centers and ports to enslave India, to enslave Africa, eventually to seize and steal the oil of the Middle East, and to enslave the parts of Africa where they could settle and land their people, to lord, as Uber mentioned, to Hitler's great admiration over the black majority populations. But they're out for, as I said last time with in my presentation in Palmerston, they're out for greed. They're out for profit. The American Golden Gate to Asia cannot even be justified until the 1940s or 50s in those terms. There is none. But the avalanche has been launched. The momentum is building. The stones are rolling down the hill. It is getting bigger, and the dream gets bigger. In the 1930s, two individuals in America of enormous influence, neither of them are politicians, boost this fantasy. The first, and obviously the important one, is Henry Luce, the founder of Time magazine and of Life magazine, who, remember, shows Americans what to see and tells Americans what to think across the entire European continent, when every major American newspaper, including the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times, is simply the paper of record, with many rivals, in its own city alone. It is Time magazine that gives the American people a national, centralized, directed way of viewing the world and looking at the news. And it doesn't help that Luce really is a journalistic genius. I admire him enormously. Not as a human being, and not for his politics, but as a technical newsman. I only started to rise in the news business when I came across and was taught to appreciate the technical capabilities in my late 20s of Time magazine and Life. The photographers they sent out, the technical excellence of their cameras and their film, the way those pictures were cropped and used in perspective in both newspapers and in a very different way in news magazines, and in sequence to tell stories. The art of captioning news photographs, the art of headlines and subheadlines and subheads to organize your thoughts so that when you actually read what's in the paragraph, you've already been prepared what to think about them and how to interpret them. This is essential in the field of communications, and it's fungible. It carries over into our mass media to this day. It's essential for the art of communication. And Henry Luce is the Isaac Newton, or if you prefer, the Leibniz, or the Einstein, or the Nikola Tesla of mass modern communications. And it spills over into other languages too. And he is the son of American Christian missionaries in China who revere and idealize China. And he is also a fool, because he believes Chiang Kai-shek, a merciless killer, drug dealer, totally at home in cutting deals with and acting as a hatchet man for the organized crime syndicates, as well as protecting the bankers of Shanghai. A man who was ruler of China from 1925 to 1948, or at least of much of China, is directly responsible for 10 million executions and murderers. Had Mao not existed, Chiang would go down in history as the greatest killer in Chinese history since Genghis Khan himself. But he pretends to be a Methodist. And therefore Time magazine presents him to the dumb American people for 45 years as a great Christian gentleman and martyr and saint, as well, of course, as champion of democracy and free market economics. When his Kuomintang, the KMT, flees the mainland from the communists and takes over Taiwan with full American support as a bastion against communism, of course, after 1948-49, the first thing they do is mercilessly repress the Taiwanese people and slaughter tens of thousands of them, especially those of them who are teachers, who are librarians, who are educators, who are work in or lecture in universities. The entire an entire generation of Taiwanese intellectuals and intelligentsia is either forced underground when they are lucky, or mercilessly slaughtered where they are not, with full American approval, because they're just Chiang Kai-shek has labeled them as communists, and that's all you need to know. Yet more casualties on the side of the American delusion in Asia. But Luce sells America on the idea of a good China, a Christian China, a Protestant China on Midwest virtuous terms, Iowa in Sichuan, Iowa in Guangdong, right? Seattle rebuilt as a shining city on a hill in Shanghai. And generations of Americans believe this ridiculous delusion. They further believe it when Pearl Buck comes along. Pearl-esque Buck is another example of the Nobel Committee for Literature yet again finding some utterly ludicrous, inept embarrassment of a buffoon and awarding them the Nobel Peace Prize. No, not Peace Prize, in her case for literature, the Nobel Prize for Literature. Right? And she's writing about lives of the Chinese peasants. Is she a Chinese peasant? Of course not. Does she have any idea how Chinese peasants really live when they're in their lives? Doesn't have a clue. Does she know anything about Chinese religion or culture or history? Again, doesn't have a clue. And these, of course, as my contemporary, the late Charlie Krauthammer, who was swallowing 400 newspapers across America, like Krauthammer, Pearl Buck's very ignorance and incompetence and illiteracy is the source of her strength. Because in both cases, it gives them a moral certainty, a clarity of vision, an idea in the classic Midwest hick style that they have what Tolstoy calls the magic stick, the green stick, the little magical stick somewhere in a Russian forest. It's so simple and it will solve all the problems of humanity at a single wave. And you don't need anything else if you've got the green stick. Now, for different American loons, the green stick takes different forms. For Woodrow Wilson, it was the form of national self-determination. Just give the president's friends, Masaryk in Czechoslovakia, Venizelos in Greece, Paderewski, the pianist of all things, in Poland, a free hand to wave, and they won't create racist, or King Alexander of Serbia. They won't create racist, repressive, genocidal little mini empires across Europe that will cause generations of hatred and counter-massacre and slaughter and rebellion that continue to this day 100 years more later. No, it's the magic formula. Everything will work out perfectly and simply. What's that? Ambassador Bullitt, you are telling me there are 5 million Germans in Sudetenland who the Czechs have enslaved? But President Masaryk never informed me of this. Of course he didn't, you simplistic loon. Henry Luce is another of those dangerous American idiots, and so is Pearl Buck. Pearl Buck writes an enormous book about the glories of the Chinese peasantry as they suffer in starvation, which they certainly did, trying to farm her land. And it's a tragic story in which the kind, virtuous peasants are succeeded by the worthless children who sell out to the evil money men of Shanghai. Not a communist in sight, not an American banker in sight. Farming the land in misery and poverty and despair is the highest, with the Christian Bible at hand and some loving American Methodist missionaries to pat you on the head, is the highest level to which anyone in China can possibly aspire or rise. This is the Pearl Buck vision, and it wins her the Nobel Prize for Literature, and it makes her one of the best-selling American authors of all time through the 1930s. And there is a technically very good movie made of the Good Earth. They don't even have Chinese people playing the leads. I think Jane Darnell, who I stand to be corrected, but it's really remade a few years later and in a much better form but it's the same theme about the Dust Bowl, based on John Steinbeck's infinitely superior novel. Steinbeck is writing about America he loves and understands and has traveled in. So to read a really bad book, read The Good Earth. To read a really good book on the same theme, read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Steinbeck also wins the Nobel Prize for Literature for his work, but he deserves it. But these books have influence, including with the President of the United States himself, the greatest of them, Franklin Roosevelt, who means well towards China, but really believes that Chiang Kai-shek can be reformed for good, and his the corrupt people around him will can be harnessed for good. It's totally delusional and it's totally false. And the Republicans, of course, go along with this because it is the Republicans in the 1930s, largely because they admire Hitler and don't want to go to war with Hitler, but they want an American empire built. So their idea is, give Hitler a free hand in Europe and he'll take care of the communists for us while we build the empire of the future in Asia. Franklin Roosevelt deals with these people very cynically but very skillfully. Their leader is one of the... is one of the two men who Franklin Roosevelt regarded as one of the two most dangerous political threats in America to freedom and democracy. Communist? Of course not. General Douglas MacArthur, for 4 years Chief of the General Staff, who with FDR's blessing is sent out to empty glory as Chief of Staff and military advisor to the emerging Republic of the Philippines in 1937. Now in this role, MacArthur, who was already at retirement age. Let's see, he died at the age of 84, so he isn't actually in his 60s, but he is in his 50s when he retires out to the Philippines. And he recognizes there is a threat from Japan, but he's complacent about the threat, like Churchill before him. Churchill and MacArthur, incidentally, share a great-great-great-grandmother in common, an American lady who lived out. There are photographs of her online, and I forget the state. I stand to be corrected. I think it was she lived in South Carolina. Maybe it was North Carolina. But you will find her online. Find her easily, actually. If anyone wants to look it up while I'm speaking, feel free to do so. They actually have an ancestral great-great-great-great-great-grandmother in common, which is fitting since they are almost exactly the same age, and since, of course, they are both extraordinarily racist, arrogant, and both have flashes of genius, very definitely. And MacArthur, when he is forced to be, is an outstanding general. But he also makes enormous screw-ups, as we are about to see. But he believes the American plan is very realistic for the Philippines in the event of war with Japan. And it is this, that the Philippines must be surrendered. They are indefensible. They are all the way across the Pacific Ocean, and America's main military and industrial might is on the East Coast as well. This is before the days of jet or even long-range aircraft. Battleships are still largely coal-burning, and even with turbine battleships, the Japanese have more of them than we do. And Billy Mitchell has already, in the 1920s, shown that battleships can be sunk by biplanes. He's doing this at naval maneuvers on the east coast of the United States in the early 1920s. But General Billy Mitchell, of course, is far too ahead of his time. And MacArthur, as one of the most senior generals in the American military, goes along with the court marshalling of General Billy Mitchell. And Billy Mitchell was the one who predicted that the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor could be sunk by the Japanese by a preemptive surprise attack from aircraft carriers. And he's saying this in the 1920s. And for saying this, what happens to General Mitchell? Why, he is cashiered out of the United States Army in shame, of course. And he dies of heart disease, I believe, in his 50s, a broken man, because he was right too soon. But again, even if Japan can project power, if Japan has no conflict with the United States, it won't matter. But the United States is imposing racist limitations on Japanese immigration to the United States, which is necessary for Japan to relieve its population pressure. And is imposing unfair terms of trade in Japan. And Japan must buy its oil and most of it, and its from America, and its rubber from British-controlled Malaya. And there are rich deposits which Japan cannot afford or is kept under limits from buying commercially in New Guinea. And Japanese immigrants are not allowed into Australia under the virtually Nazi-level racist laws that Billy Hughes has bequeathed to his populist successors in white Australia in the 1920s and 1930s. So what's Japan to do? Well, the Japanese try and carve out an empire for themselves inland in China, where there are at least huge coal resources, and coal still matters. But they also are developing extremely racist attitudes, not just towards the Koreans, but towards the Chinese. Attitudes that are similar, very similar to German attitudes towards Ukrainians and Russians, and even towards Jews, towards the Unterslaven of the East, because the Japanese are, of course, the Bushido. They're the master race. They're the master race of East Asia. And they're a militarist power. And they are not peace-loving entirely, to put it mildly. And they never buy into the hogwash of eternal peace for all time of the League of Nations. America buys into it, more under Republicans than Democrats. Republicans can be even more stupid and delusional than Democrats when they get the bit between their teeth. We're talking a lot about Nobel Peace Prizes and prizes for literature being handed out here. As you see, the standard is lower than getting a plastic toy in a box of cornflakes, right? If you can pull a plastic toy out of a box of cornflakes, you certainly qualify for the Nobel Prize for literature, and most of all for peace, given the eminent standards of the 20th century. Because a Republican Secretary of State in 1928-29, Frank Kellogg, he may actually, I haven't even looked into it, he may even be a scion of the Kellogg cornflake factory, gets a rather good plastic toy. He gets a Nobel Prize for Peace. What is his diplomatic achievement? Along with the foreign minister of France, Briand, he has outlawed war for the human race in 1928. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is solemnly signed by every significant nation in the world. Look it up. Nobody will believe me on this. You can't. It's impossible to believe, but it happens to be true. Outlaws war for the entire human race in 1928. Wow, that really worked out well, didn't it? Let that sink in for a minute. So Japan is not going to be a threat. But nevertheless, the American Navy has its base in Hawaii, its primary base. They are building up military forces, of course, purely as a deterrent force against Japan in the Far East. And they are not giving Japan, they are morally disapproving of Japan's intervention to enslave northern China after 1931, the so-called Manchurian Incident. Japan is condemned by the League of Nations in 1931. This is a clear violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. How can you outlaw war? And then one of your member states, the League of Nations, goes ahead and seizes a huge chunk with 100 million or so Chinese inhabitants to be enslaved in it? Bad show. So at Geneva, led by the idiot Secretary General of the League of Nations at the time, Arthur Henderson, a former British Foreign Secretary, again a man whose sheer idiocy must be studied and appreciated to be believed. It is beyond imagining. You condemn Japan, and Japan will, of course, immediately pull out of Manchuria meekly and leave all the coal deposits of Japan it desperately needs to feed its growing industry and its starving population, and all will be hunky-dory and happily ever after. Well, of course, it doesn't happen. But America has a moralizing Secretary of State at the time, Henry Stimson, who we will meet again later, a man who is so pure and morally upright that he refuses to allow American intelligence to monitor Japanese diplomatic communications because gentlemen do not do that to each other. But of course, in later years, Henry Stimson shows he is capable of growth and change. He is an enthusiastic advocate for the dropping of both atomic bombs in Japan at the end of World War II. So his high-mindedness, which makes an eternal enemy of Japan in 1931, does not extend to him opposing the burning alive of 1 million Japanese civilians in the American B-29 napalm air raids of 1944 and 1945. Or the dropping of the only 2 atomic weapons to be used in anger so far against any human population at all, to end World War II against the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 doesn't extend to that, does it? Franklin Roosevelt takes office. He said he is inheriting a deterioration with Japan, and he does not want the situation with Japan to deteriorate too badly. He disapproves very strongly of the merciless behavior of the Japanese military and aristocrat-directed political entities against China. He wants to stop it. So he applies moral force. The only thing moral force succeeds in doing is convincing the Japanese that eventually America will go to war against Japan, because does America have war plans to destroy Japan? Of course they do. Then, of course, they also have war plans to destroy the British Empire, drawn up at the same time in the 1920s. Like the German military before 1914, all major war staffs draw up contingency planning to do the unspeakable to everybody. We do it. The Soviets did it. The Russians have it. Everybody does it. There was a classic Justice League of America comic about 25 years ago, in which Batman shocked Superman and Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and the Flash and all the other heroes in the Justice League by showing he had drawn up contingency plans how to kill all of them if they went rogue or got out of control. Interestingly enough, the only one he didn't draw up plans of how to kill was Batman himself, right? It was a lovely piece of characterization. But all the other members of the Justice League are really Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts at heart. They're shocked that Batman can be so merciless, so paranoid. But Batman came from Gotham City. There wasn't much to choose between them, right? He comes from a city full of twisted gangsters and psychopaths. Maybe it was North Belfast after all, right? So he realizes that these things happen in the world. I don't know if I ever told it to this audience, or if I have, it's so long ago and I talk so much you will have forgotten it. But I wrote an article for the Washington Times in the spring of 1990 predicting that Saddam Hussein was going to invade Kuwait to seize its oil and conquer all of it. The article was regarded as so ridiculous by my senior editors at the time that they refused to run it. An extraordinarily watered-down, harmless version of it ran the day before Saddam actually invaded. Right? Now, I kept my job, which could not be foreseen at the time because the rows I had with my bosses over it were bitter. And these people were not fools. I could paint them as fools. They were able, outstanding people, but they were American. And the idea that Saddam Hussein could misunderstand America or ignore America or defy America and go ahead and do the unthinkable and invade Kuwait anyway was unthinkable to them. So why had I written the article? I dined out on the article for 30 or 40 years afterwards. As you see right now, I still bring it up to impress people. And what actually happened? I had a wonderful source. I had the best source in the world. Was it the Mossad? No. Was it New York bankers or the City of London, who of course control everything? No. Was it even the KGB and the Russians? No, they were taken by surprise too. Wasn't the Israelis, wasn't the Americans, wasn't the Brits, wasn't even the Vatican. Who was my source? Who predicted the invasion so perfectly? Can nobody here answer my question? Who was my source? My source was Saddam Hussein himself. He made no secret of it. He had said what he was going to do repeatedly in speeches throughout Iraq for the previous 6 months. All of this was documented and reported in English in the United States by a wonderful system that Bill Clinton and his administration shut down. It was called FIBIS, the Foreign Intelligence Broadcast Information Service. FIBIS, F-I-B-I-S. And every day, if you worked at the State Department, or if, like me, you covered the State Department for one of the major news outlets in Washington, you received your free copy, or you had access to and nobody bothered reading it. And they produced FIBIS for the whole world. FIBIS translated into English in real time, sometimes a few days later, but still soon enough to be relevant and significant. All the major speeches by every major president, head of state, finance minister, and major commodities minister in the world. And it was shut down to save money by that idiot Warren Christopher and his people in the early 1990s. Right? And I did my due diligence. I was covering the Middle East. And I couldn't read all of FIBIS. Nobody could. But I kept an eye on the Russian on FIBIS covering the Soviet Union and Russia. And I also read carefully FIBIS on the Middle East. And there was Saddam. And other people were reading this too. So what was the difference between me and every other analyst in Washington? I came from Gotham City. I came from North Belfast. If any of you wants to, write me and I'll send you the relevant article I wrote as a memoir years later at UPI about this, right? Because I had covered an otherwise totally unknown in Washington figure. Nobody has written PhD. My friend Martin Dillon, the finest investigative reporter of our generation, and one man still, thankfully, very much with us, wrote a wonderful and terrifying book called The Shankill Butchers. Captain Leonard Murphy was the head of the West Belfast Brigade of the Ulster Volunteer Force, a Protestant paramilitary organization that was really simply a terrorist gang that specialized in kidnapping innocent Catholic people and slitting their throats after they had tortured them hideously to hear their death screams in torture chambers, specially soundproofed for the occasion. They even had tilted floors so you could hose off all the blood from the floor much more efficiently. They were very state of the art, right? In late 1970s and early 80s Belfast. And so terrible and terrifying was Lenny Murphy that no criminal prosecution was ever brought against him. The British government, to their great credit, repeatedly tried. They were not the problem. It's easy to say, oh, this was an evil British plot. No, it was not. It was an outgrowth of human savagery in a civil war by the smallest group in the Civil War. But so great was the terror that this individual psychopath installed that nobody was willing to testify against him. On the one occasion when a fellow prisoner in the Crumlin Road prison in Belfast turned Queen's evidence to turn against him, Lenny Murphy was able to walk around the prison with impunity into his cell and strangle a poor fellow with his bare hands. And no action was ever taken. Eventually, he was slaughtered, not by the British Army, not by the British police, not even by the Irish Republican Army, but by a more powerful faction of the Protestant paramilitaries, whose protection rackets he was impinging upon unwisely at the time. They leaked information to him to the IRA, who riddled him with more than 40 bullets to make sure, right? But Lenny Murphy never killed cold. He always had to drink a lot in front of his admiring audience, including some of us from the media at the time, at the Brown Bear Bar in Belfast. And he had to wind himself up into a killing rage. And Saddam Hussein had been a personal torturer. I mean, a literal torturer. He liked to torture people to death and see the blood flow and hear their screams in the First Ba'ath Republic of 1963 in Iraq. And Saddam never lost the taste or the habits. So when I was reading about Saddam's threats to Kuwait, a decade later, I made the link. I thought, this is not something you learn about at Harvard School of Government, or Yale, or even in the Skull and Bones Club. This is not something you learn sitting worshipfully at the feet of great theorists like Hans Morgenthau, or what have you. This is really serious shit. This guy is like Lenny Murphy. It's anyone here follow baseball? The great pitchers in baseball can throw a ball at 90 miles an hour or 97 miles an hour. It's automatically clocked now for decades, right? Seems impossible, but they can. But they all have wind-ups to do it. They don't just toss a ball. They spin their arms around to get the circulation up, and then whoosh, the ball goes out at maximum power. And psychopaths and killers can be like that, which is so many murders are committed when abusers are drunk. They have to work themselves up into a killing rage. And before that, they're perfectly charming. Lenny Murphy, I will tell you, was the life and soul of the party. Of course, everybody always laughed at his jokes. I did. When you are dealing with psychopaths and they have the power to kill unbelievably and horribly with impunity, even in tiny Northern Ireland and certainly across the Middle East, it pays to be polite to them. You may walk away alive. This is not a small thing. You do not learn this in courses of higher education on international affairs, which why so many of them are a fucking waste of time. You do not call it bluff. The Americans called the bluff of Japan in 1941. There was one individual in particular who, even more than Douglas MacArthur, was central to the American delusion in Asia. He is second only to Theodore Roosevelt himself as being the Pied Piper of destruction, who led at least 300,000 American boys to their doom in not one, but 3 major consecutive wars in Asia, all of which could and should have been avoided and were entirely unnecessary. And this individual was, his name is well known to most, if not all of you, but I don't think any of you would imagine him in this role. But he was central to all of them. Anyone want to suggest before I... Future Secretary of State Dean Acheson, architect of NATO. Acheson was always a self-righteous pain in the neck. In 1934, when President Franklin Roosevelt is saving the American economy and the American financial system too, for which he gets no thanks, of course, from utter collapse at the hands of Herbert Hoover's quasi-socialist bungling throughout the Great Depression, the only one of his officials to resign in anger and protest because of the way he has devalued the price of gold, which was a very sensible move at the time, is Dean Acheson as Undersecretary of the Treasury. And Acheson, as we now know, hated and was jealous of FDR personally. Acheson came from a family, of course, of Northern Irish Protestant stock via Canada, and he came from a modest background, which meant that when he was accepted by the wise men, the elite at Harvard and Yale, whom he then spent the rest of his time effortlessly hobnobbing among, he was a bigger snob, intellectual snob, and social snob than any of them. And he especially turned down his nose at President Roosevelt, FDR, who he was deeply jealous of. Nevertheless, FDR, A, did not know this, and B, was, as most of us, all of us know, a genuinely generous and decent and forgiving man. And in this case, it was a disaster that he was, because he gives Dean Acheson a significant position, after all, at the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State dealing with East Asian affairs in his second and third term. And Dean Acheson, like all his ilk, is moralistic and is determined to teach the Japanese a lesson. And he, to a degree, technically approved by the president, but the president doesn't really pay much attention to it. And the actual Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, is a repulsive and stupid nonentity from Tennessee, whose twin passions are building the United Nations as a world organization to enforce world peace. See how that turned out for you? And of course, Cordell Hull's obsession is another green stick, another simplistic, hick Midwestern solution to all the problems of the human race: free trade. Universal free trade will solve everything, especially if you destroy the tariff barriers protecting American industry. How does that work out for you? So with Cordell Hull as his boss, Dean Acheson can do what he likes. And what does he do in 1941? He imposes an embargo on all oil and rubber and precious materials and steel exports to Japan to stop Japanese aggression in China. That'll show him, won't it? After all, Dean Acheson is another racist. There are three, apart from Japan, there are three peoples that Dean Acheson totally despises. None of them will be a surprise to you. The entire Indian people, who he regards as beneath contempt and unworthy of self-government. The Catholic Irish, of course. He's very anti-Semitic too. Despises all Jews. But above all, he has no time for Arabs. They'll never have an impact in the world, right? So actually, it's four races, right? Because you can't forget the Jews in there as well. But at least he's an equal opportunity bigot, right? He does approve of Pakistan when it's eventually formed. He thinks Pakistan is much more important to America than India will ever be, right? This is the level of genius we're dealing with. And he is the direct cause of World War II in Asia, because it is the economic embargo on Japan that gives the Japanese militarists, especially in the Japanese Navy, the free hand to plot aggressive war against the United States, and they give Admiral Yamamoto the free hand with the personal approval and encouragement of Emperor Hirohito, the Showa Emperor himself, to launch the strike on Pearl Harbor. Now, at an operational and tactical level, the attacks on Pearl Harbor and on the Philippines are extraordinary triumphs. But strategically, of course, they are a catastrophe for Japan. At first, they appear to be a catastrophe for President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt has been working hard to try and provoke Adolf Hitler in provoking a war with the United States in the Atlantic. But he doesn't, because he recognizes, since America, as long as France, FDR is not a warmonger. FDR strategically is very clear on what he wants the war to be. He wants Britain and France to contain Germany, and he is ready to give all the American credit and all the American industrial might and contracts, which are also good for helping pull America out of the Great Depression. It's good business for America to supply battleships and armor plate and armor for tanks and superb American Browning machine guns. The Battle of Britain is won with Browning machine guns on Spitfire fighters. The British would have lost the Battle of Britain if they did not not have reliable American Browning 303, even light caliber machine guns to equip on the Hurricane and Spitfire fighter to shut down the Luftwaffe. They needed American industrial might even then, but under FDR they had to pay for it. And even when Britain goes bankrupt, as it effectively does in 1940, FDR keeps the financial as well as military flow of aid to Britain up, because otherwise Western civilization will be destroyed and America will rearm too late. And FDR recognizes this. So Lend-Lease is not a sellout to the British Empire, and it is not a sellout to the Soviets either, when FDR later extends it to the Soviet Union. It is an act of strategic brilliance that saves hundreds of thousands and even millions of American lives, which are killed for them by the Soviet Union equipped with American Studebaker trucks, and most of all eating spam from Iowa and Indiana, and from all across the Midwest, and Kansas, of course, can't forget Kansas, especially since I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan, instead. But FDR does not want or see the need for a war against Japan. Japan can be dealt with peacefully by overwhelming Western power once Nazi Germany has been destroyed. And even through the war, he wants to keep the primary strategic thrust of the war against Germany. But as we shall see, he doesn't quite succeed. He isn't quite able to do that. But it is Acheson who pulls America into the war by the harsh embargo he puts on Japan, which has the opposite effect from intended. Like America's sanctions against Russia since 2014, Japan has no ally to give it support against the American embargo. So they must steal the war resources for themselves. But to do that, they must prevent the American fleet intervening. Now, ironically, if Yamamoto had not overextended himself and sunk the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, if he had simply struck against the British and French and Dutch colonies in East Asia, he may well have gotten away with it. Because FDR did not want a war against Japan, and the peace in Japan pro-Hitler lobby does not want to go to war with Japan in the first place. Doesn't want to go to war with Japan in the first place. But Yamamoto, there are mistakes and miscalculations on every side. Yamamoto makes his by not only attacking the U.S. Navy in Pearl Harbor, but by sinking those 8 battleships and killing several thousand American sailors. And my own late father-in-law had hearing problems for the rest of his life because he was serving in the U.S. Army in Hawaii in December 1941. And he was bombed by the Japanese, and he later took his own personal fearsome revenge on them as a decorated combat soldier with the American Division fighting through New Guinea across the Owen Stanley Mountains in 1942 and 1943. All these events, both big and small, have repercussions that continue, and we see cascading to this day. Now, Acheson stays in obscurity and is never hung out to dry for his criminal incompetence in triggering the war in Asia, which costs hundreds of thousands of American lives, as well as countless millions of Asian ones. And later, of course, he impresses Harry S. Truman far more than he ever impressed Franklin Roosevelt, and Truman raises him up to being Secretary of State. The late Herbert Meyer, who was a friend to me, and I suppose you could say a mentor, when he was recommended to me as a source in the Washington Times after he left government as Bill Casey's right-hand man as Director of Intelligence Analysis, and which he de facto was at the CIA for the first half of the 80s, said a very memorable thing. He actually wasn't a professional spook. He was a professional analyst for Forbes magazine. And it was that simplicity and clarity of sight and analysis, combined with power of mind, that recommended him to Casey, which is why he got the Soviet Union right in its economic decline, when all the great towering figures in the $90 billion a year, even then, American intelligence community, were getting everything worthlessly wrong. Meyer, who died a couple of years ago, said to me, Marty, never forget this. And he was right, I lived it later, being fashionably wrong in Washington, in government or in the media, when everybody else is, being totally and ridiculously and absurdly wrong, when everybody else is, will never hurt your career prospects or advancement. It will only boost you and strengthen you. But to make the same mistake that I did, he said, to be right too soon when nobody else is, that's going to kill you every time. It's going to destroy you in Washington. And he made another career for himself entirely. He recognized the writing on his wall in his 40s, fled Washington as far as you could flee in America, went out to live with his family on an idyllic island off Seattle that you could only reach by seaplane. He wanted to be as far from the agency and its wise men and the think tanks of Washington and all their works as you possibly could be. And he became a business analyst and motivational speaker very brilliantly and successfully for the rest of his life. But of course, I didn't realize that my own future was being prophetically quoted to me, being right too soon. Acheson was wrong at all the right times to be wrong. In 1950, he's Secretary of State, and his best friend has just been outed as a Soviet spy by Senator Richard Nixon, on which Nixon's brilliant career is later based. Nixon was a congressman, used his investigation of an exposure of Al Gore Hiss to become a senator, and then, of course, within 2 years, he's at J. Edgar Hoover's right-hand man, and he becomes vice president for 8 years to Dwight Eisenhower, who always distrusted and loathed him, right? Eisenhower is asked in 1955, in the late 1950s, Dick Wilson is being talked about as your potential successor. What are his achievements as vice president in the last 4 years? And Eisenhower, who was not a sweet and lovable and innocent fellow at all, who was a cynic himself, but had a brilliant brain, of course, says, give me a week or two and maybe I'll come up with one for you. That's the highest endorsement he ever made of Richard Nixon. Nixon, by turn, describes Eisenhower in Nixon's recollections of him as devious and manipulative. And as the British historian Paul Johnson rightly says, Nixon himself is rightly regarded as an expert on such matters, on being devious and manipulative. And Eisenhower was devious and manipulative even by his standards, right? But Acheson has put America into it's the biggest a war in Asia that FDR never wanted to fight, and hundreds of thousands of American boys die in that war. And what does Truman make of him? He loves him. And the more Acheson bad-mouthed President Roosevelt, the more Truman, who hated President Roosevelt and was jealous of him, loved him for it. So he makes him Secretary of State. And Acheson's first strategic pride and joy, of course, is NATO, which nearly 80 years later, more than 75 years later, is now propelling us and pulling us into destruction in the thermonuclear world war with Russia. And it was Acheson, with Truman's blessing and backing, who sets it up. But what does Acheson do with Asia? Acheson in 1950 is an embattled man. His best friend, showing his brilliant judge of character, is Al Gore Hiss, a leading economic figure, and one of the architects of the Bretton Woods system in 1944, but who has also been exposed as being a Soviet intelligence asset at the height of the Cold War, which Acheson denies all through his life, but through which documents released in the Soviet Union most definitely support, if not confirmed, there's always some ambiguity in these things, in the 1990s. Acheson is asked what his attitude, if he will condemn Hiss after Hiss's duplicity and unreliability at the very least have been exposed. He replies, I will not be Judas, play Judas to Hiss when Hiss is being crucified the way Christ was. Look up the exact quote. It's a little different, but it's a rather unfortunate and misleading and out of context use of the New Testament and the Gospels, to put it mildly. That's the kind of man Acheson is, right? But then, while under emotional pressure for this, he makes a much bigger boo-boo a couple of weeks later, again speaking at the National Press Club in Washington. On the record, he lists the number of nations in East Asia that the United States will go to war to defend against any quote-unquote unprovoked communist attack. It's very comprehensive. It includes Taiwan, Formosa as then was, it includes Japan, it includes the Philippines. It does not include South Korea. So Stalin in Moscow and the North Korean communist leadership in Pyongyang both take this as a clear signal from Acheson that it's okay for them to unify Korea by taking over the South. And of course, having lost China is an interesting concept because China was never America's to lose. But the fall of China to the communists in 1949 is a thunderclap to Americans. It's much bigger than the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the fall of Afghanistan was. It is huge because remember, through Time magazine and Pearl S. Buck, which I spent so much time on, the American Midwest, the sophisticated American, as they imagine themselves to be, Midwest, believes China is Protestant, Christian, and Methodist, and democratic, with the way the Republican Party and the Kiwanis are, and the Elks are, and the Raccoons are, and all the clubs of the social clubs of Midwest America are. This has been replicated in China because Pearl Buck and Time magazine have told them so. And Chiang Kai-shek is this great Christian Democrat and gentleman and saint, right? And all of a sudden, for this virtuous, good, kind, tamed, predictable Protestant Midwest China to join Stalin and the communists, there must be a global conspiracy behind it. The fact that the Americans mucking around in China didn't have a clue what they were dealing with or who they were dealing with or what the Chinese people were experiencing or suffering or learning from that suffering or how they were reacting against that suffering. None of these questions are asked. And the handful, it is literally less than 10 people you could count, who are genuine American experts on China and what is going on in China, either in government or in the media. Then, of course, they must have been communist dupes all along, and they are literally driven out of America. They are not actually shot, but they are driven out of America. They are driven out of government service. They are driven out of Time magazine. The New York Times, of course, will not touch them with a barge pole. And until Kissinger and Nixon, of all people, come along, because Kissinger and Nixon are in the Rockefellers' pockets, but they are at least smart. And they are capable. Had Wikipedia existed, Nixon would have consulted Wikipedia. And he does consult the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, published like so many British imperial transplants in America, in the heartland of Chicago, no less, since 1911 at least. And what does the Encyclopedia excellent entry on Chinese-Vietnamese relations tell them? It tells them what even John F. Kennedy was not really aware of, and what that idiot Lyndon Johnson certainly never knew or bothered to find out. Kennedy would have had he lived, but of course he's knocked out of the way, so Alan Dulles can whisper in LBJ's ear and Robert McNamara's ear. And Robert McNamara can take his cost-cutting genius techniques that worked so well at making in Detroit the industrial superpower of the 21st century, I don't think. And they make this, they don't realize that the Vietnamese people have had the same hatred, fear, and terror towards the Chinese that the Polish people have had towards the Russians, in both cases with good reason. But that's no reason to go to world war with China on behalf of Vietnam, nor is it a reason to imagine that if North Vietnam conquers South Vietnam, China is then going to be Vietnam's boon ally and conquer the whole of Asia, which is what Lyndon Johnson and McNamara and their geniuses imagine. That's what they imagine, right? And who was supporting the rush to war against Vietnam in 1964 and 65, just as he supported the rush to war against Korea in 1950? Why, Dean Acheson, of course. So Dean Acheson is fanning the flames of America's disastrous war in Vietnam, just as he got in America through his total incompetence into the war against North Korea, backed by Russia and China in 1950. And of course, he totally failed to predict the Chinese intervention in the war, so did MacArthur in 1950. And if you are a false prophet, like Dean Acheson was then, or like Thomas Friedman has been through his entire appalling life on the issues of free trade, and now supporting Ukraine and standing up to Russia and never letting Munich happen again, the more people who die at your hands, it's like a blood sacrifice. They cannot admit they have slaughtered all these innocent people through stupidity, and they can never dare to admit, both from shameless fear and cowardice and also from their own egomania, that they were wrong all along. And so bigger lies and mistakes compound earlier lies and mistakes. And so we have this tradition. And I must stop now for reasons of time, obviously, but I have not even yet got to what you have already know very well as economic nationalists. And that is the gutting of the American industrial base, not just at the hands of China, but the collapse of Detroit and American steel at the hands of Japanese and South Korean steel. And this was not done by Japanese or South Korean evil manipulative plotting. Of course, they used influence and they used access and they used their economic wealth, as anybody would in those circumstances, as America did when it was rising. No, our leaders did it to us. And we were stupid enough to let them do it because we believed in free trade. And most of all, we believed we had to have the friendship and alliance of South Korea and Japan. And we had to have Japan in the World Trade Organization because we had to make China democratic in American ways. The first President Bush, who was admirable in many respects, was also catastrophic and overrated in many others, and above all else was a macroeconomic, delusional ignoramus. And that's even when he knew what he was doing, which Reagan did not. They believed that and Clinton certainly believed, the great genius, that letting China into the American market with no tariff protection for America would lead to a golden age of democracy, American style, in China. At the end of the day, Bill Clinton was as much an arrogant, ignorant hick about China as Henry Luce was, as Theodore Roosevelt was, as Pearl S. Buck was, and as Dean Acheson was. So we look back at 125 years of American economic appeasement of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and most of all China itself. And what do we see? China would have had to find its own path anyway. It would have been it did not have to be surrounded by American military bases, which have not impinged upon its rise at all, but would have simply convinced the Chinese with very good reason that America is determined to destroy China and will never let China emerge in the world. It was a Russian analyst, not even a geopolitician, but one of their most successful and formidable businessmen, Igor Sechin, former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, and today veteran chief, what's the term? He was CEO, Chief Executive Officer of one of the largest oil corporations in the world today, who is therefore used to looking at real power as opposed to delusional myths of power. He runs Rosneft, Russia Oil, which is as big and powerful and formidable and impressive and successful as the name indicates. They have not followed green, ludicrous Greta Thunberg delusions. They do not believe the world is green. They do not believe the world is flat. These are delusions that even in the Middle Ages, educated people did not believe. But primeval idiots, of course, did. And Thomas Friedman still does today. Of course they do. So we are at the end of 125 years of the great God King prophet Theodore Roosevelt's vision that the future lies in Asia. Well, it does. The future of the world arguably lies in Asia, especially if they can stay out of a thermonuclear exchange between America and Russia and NATO. And because of the population bias and the talents of the Chinese and Indian peoples, especially, and the other peoples of Asia, of course the future was always going to lie in Asia. But that did not mean that 125 years of a handful of American delusional idiots had to sacrifice the blood and wealth and future of their country in delusional policies in Asia, which they had. The Golden Gate Bridge is a bridge to San Francisco. I can't even remember where it goes to. Does it go to Oakland? I think it goes to Oakland. Correct me, someone from Northern California, please. But the Golden Gate Bridge is a bridge from one part of Northern California to another part of Northern California.
San Francisco to Marin County to the north, Martin.
Thank you. Good oil. No oil there, but lots of wonderful wines, you will agree, right? Lots of wonderful wines in Marin County. Right, but it is not a bridge it is not a golden gate to Asia. The golden gate to Asia that was built by Theodore Roosevelt, as documented by you so well, Magdalena, was built on lies, and it has tottered and collapsed repeatedly on lies, and hundreds of millions of people have suffered the consequences as a result over the past 125 years, and they still are to this day. Thank you.
As always, Marty, what an opus. That's just a fantastic wrapping up of the trilogy. I mean, I didn't expect this, but you really did create a beautiful, I think, bookend to the trilogy that Magdalena began. And so for that alone, I would throw the first question over to Magdalena. Hey, Magdalena, what'd you think of that?
Oh, wonderful. As usual, Martin. You're just outdoing yourself every single time.
Look who's talking. Thank you, Magdalena.
No. I'm not even near your
yes,
your
you
heights.
oh no.
No.
You brought us there.
So, which brings me back to my lecture, okay? Teddy Roosevelt considered the Japanese of being with all his racist views and so on, he considered Japan as being the most close to the Anglo-Saxon race, right?
Yes.
And he actually had jitsu classes in the White House. He had a teacher come and teach him.
I forgot that. You're right.
Yeah. Okay. And he had all kinds of Japanese people, top-level government people come and visit him all the time. And because of all of this, you had kind of a Japanese craze also among the society leaders. You know, the ladies would show up in kimonos and so forth. So Japan was considered to be kind of like the better of all the Asians, so to speak. Teddy had supported the Japanese in their war against Russia.
Yes.
Big time. And they actually had a little agreement going on that Japan would that the United States would not intervene with Japan lording it over Korea. And you also had this idea, then there was also the the Japanese Great Britain treaty, or some kind of a treaty that they had in 1902,
Yes.
3, somewhere out there. Yeah. Okay. So can you talk a little bit more about that? The Anglo-Japan. I'm putting you on the spot.
And Jerry went, no, it's the opposite. I'm thinking on these things, and you already expressing what I am thinking. I mean, you are so right. You're so spot on. It's brilliant. First of all, TR loves the British Empire. Mm-hmm. And of course, even in 2 R's, I go off on my wild tangents. There are other key points that I regret not bringing in, and you've just touched another one. And that is, TR has two close British imperial friends who are both into the obsession with English racist Anglo-Saxon global power over the Indian people, over the Chinese people, over everybody. But who is it? His closest friend, Lord Bryce, the British ambassador to the United States in his time, and the writer of a classic book on the American Constitution, which Bryce is politically brilliant and understands very well. But the other close friend, his soulmate.
Lodge? Henry Cabot Lodge?
No, Lodge is American too. Of course he's a racist. But you're right. But no, this is an even more familiar figure to us. Rudyard Kipling.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yes. They meet repeatedly in the Cosmos Club in Washington. Repeatedly. I think it's on only a few years away from Washington. I think it's on P Street, and I've been there often than not. But then again, I always took the free booze, so I wasn't in the state to look at the signposts whenever I came out from there. But the Cosmos Club is the neocon hangout to this day, which is why I always held court in the Metropolitan Club instead. Or as my wife always liked to say, where you and your old geezer friends like to imagine you're still running the world. As if, of course, we ever did, but there you are, right? Well, Washington has believe me, has its levels of petty, petite bourgeois snobbery. And the more petite, the more intense they are. But when TR dies in 1919, Kipling writes a poem about him. It's worth looking up. It's so revealing and lachrymose. Greatheart has died. Greatheart. And in other places, Edmund Morris quotes him on this. He recalls those wonderful evenings in the Cosmos Club when they planned the genocide and enslavement of the world together. And he says, you know, we covered the whole world. And Theodore, the world's spinner. The world's spinner. Curious point, by the way, is that both Kipling and TR despise Churchill, who was identical to them in his imperialist delusions and in his catastrophic bungling to every degree. It's rather like, you know, basic principle of electricity, where like repels like. Positive and negative poles set up generating fields and alternating current. You know, I always come back to alternating current. And plus dealing with plus repels each other. And this is Teddy Roosevelt turning up his nose at Churchill. Churchill is an adventurer. He's childish. He's infantile. He's a warmonger. He's a blowhard. He writes ridiculous prose. He has an undisciplined mind. My God, TR is writing about himself. But of course, he is writing about Churchill too. It's true about both of them. Now, when it comes to Japan, there is another important parallel here. TR is a monstrous racist against all the colored and Asian peoples, right? He'll make an example for the Jews, but above all else, he wants to exterminate the very history and culture of the Native American peoples. The fact that the Native American peoples have extraordinarily rich and complex, and in many cases enlightened and humane civilizations going back 3,000 years. He not only denies this, he approves the destruction of evidence. By his, this is an unpublished book of mine, and I'll send the relevant chapter to anyone who wants. Teddy Roosevelt, the Smithsonian Institution, and the suppression of the history and heritage of the Native American peoples. This has never been documented properly. You, of course, were on it long before I even dreamed of it, Jerry. And actually, it's one of the many subjects I need to sit at your feet and learn more from. I know this, but we must directly on this. But this is so. But he makes an exception for the Japanese. The Japanese are honorary Aryans for him, just as you so wonderfully point out, Magdalena. But who is TR unique in this respect? No. He has one hugely eminent figure like him, a world empire dreamer, a visionary, a world conqueror, a man who thinks in terms of thousands of years and of the supremacy of the Anglo-Saxon race. but who also recognizes the sterling qualities of the Japanese and is ready to make a strategic global exception for them alone. Adolf Hitler, of course. At the end of 1941, Hitler welcomes the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and does not have to declare war on the United States. Thanks to Dean Acheson's incredible bungling, American outrage is so great against Japan that if FDR declares war against Hitler, who he recognizes as the real threat to Christian and democratic and humane civilization in the world, he recognizes this. He has for years before. Right? Yeah, he recognizes this. But if Germany simply stays neutral, FDR will be impeached. And there will be a grassroots movement to sweep Douglas MacArthur into the White House, and this is not far-fetched. Hitler saves him by declaring war on the United States when he is fully engaged already with the Soviet Union, and it is already clear the German army cannot defeat the Soviet Union once the Barbarossa offensive itself has just failed. So why does he do it? My old teacher at Oxford, a wonderful man who I have cited before, the late Dr. Hans Schenk, a most eminent scholar who became Dean of Wolfson College, Oxford, a writer of major, slim, but important and impeccable and crucial, vital works on European and world history himself, and on the Romantic movement and the damage it caused. A man who was descended from Austro-Hungarian aristocracy on his mother's side. His maternal grandfather was the personal private secretary to the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian imperial throne, who was assassinated at Sarajevo. And Professor Schenk, an impeccable admirer of President Roosevelt and of Western democracy, and also a devout Catholic Christian in the very best sense all his life, was puzzled by this move by Hitler, who he also regarded as an expression of, as was Stalin too, as expressions of satanic power and their power in the modern world. And he asked me and my fellow undergraduates rhetorically, why did he do this? How could he have been so insane and so stupid? His treacherous strike against the Soviet Union had already failed. As his chief of staff, Halder, had rightly said, we were up against 360 German divisions. We destroyed 260 of them. We have now identified 400 new divisions coming into the war against us that we did not suspect exist. Where will it end? Well, the whole world now knows where it ended, right? So why did he do it? But there was another great scholar who I never met. Gerhard, mental block in the name. Please, someone look it up while I'm talking. In the book is called World at War. I think Gerhard Riegener might not, or a similar name, great German-American scholar who did enormous work 30 years ago in the archives. And he showed how Hitler was always going to... Pat Buchanan's racist myth that Hitler was really sympathetic to Britain and the British Empire and to America, wanted to be bendy with us. No, that's a lie. It was never true. He always regarded as America as this contemptible... He admired the British Empire, but he felt, therefore, the very need to destroy the British so that they couldn't use their empire anymore against Germany and against Europe. But against America, he had nothing but contempt always. And the second unpublished volume of Mein Kampf, which is written while he is still in jail in the 1920s, is open and specific about the need, and you, Jerry, of course, know this already. I telepathically read your familiarity with it. The need for Germany to destroy America. But the war against Britain and over Poland and against France has come too soon, before the German navy has been built up even enough to destroy Britain, which was Hitler's plan by 1943, and to build an America-beating naval superpower with the resources of Europe and Britain behind him by 1947. German planning is very explicit about this. It's very explicit. Germany cannot strike at America because it does not have the navy to do so. And even the Royal Navy in Britain, a shadow of its former self, is more than the Germans can handle in World War II. This is clear. But Japan comes into the war with the second most powerful navy in the world. It's not number 3 anymore. It's number 2, even before they sink. Britain has only 6 aircraft carriers, and they only fly biplanes. Before World War II, the Fleet Air Arm is not allowed to develop its own modern state-of-the-art fighter planes and does not have them. Japan has 11 aircraft carriers, twice as many as the United States has operational in 1941 when they go to war. Now, FDR rightly recognizes the shortfall and has already approved the the Essex class carriers, 24 of which are built by the United States during World War II. I think 19 become operational and they don't need to build the rest. But a single Essex carrier is superior to any carrier that Britain or previously the United States or Japan itself had operational in 1940-41. And they don't become operational until 1943. But once they do, Japan is doomed, and it is doomed in record time. But that's in 1943, and Hitler has no conception of American shipbuilding capabilities or industrial capability at all. None. He's at home with air forces and armies. As he said, the sea is a foreign realm to me. I am a land animal. He says this. I am a land animal, not a sea animal. I am scared of the sea. But Japan, he recognizes, has the second navy in the world. And the Royal Navy is no match for Japan, even if the Royal Navy could have sent its entire fleet against Japan. Japan would have sunk it without breaking a sweat. Without breaking a sweat. Germany builds the Bismarck, supposedly the most modern battleship in the world. It was not. It had 8 15-inch guns, and it had a faulty rudder that kept it jamming and that led to its easy destruction at the hands of the Royal Navy in May 1941. And they only built 2 of them, the Bismarck itself and the Tirpitz. America's 4 Iowa-class carriers had radar-directed guns, 9 16-inch guns, throwing a higher throw weight of accurate artillery fire and far better armored than the Bismarck class and the sister ship Tirpitz was. But Japan has built 2 Yamato-class battleships with 18-inch guns weighing 80,000 tons and clad in armor. Now, they're actually obsolete monstrosities as soon as they're built. They never see fight against American battleships, which could probably have outranged them and outgunned them in accuracy anyway. So all those big bores would have been wasted. But in any case, they're sunk by limitless numbers of torpedoes and bombs from American Avengers attack aircraft launched from the new capital ship of the age, the Essex-class carrier. But that's later in the war. Hitler goes to war in 1941 because Japan has a navy, a world-class navy that can bring the war to America's shores when Germany itself cannot. And that is Hitler's miscalculation. It doesn't appear to be a miscalculation because Hitler is thinking in arithmetic terms. He's not thinking in Leibniz terms. He's not thinking in terms of calculus. Calculus is about growth and rates of growth and accelerating growth. It's very useful. It's crucial in astronomy, which is why Newton steals it from Leibniz, as, of course, Cynthia has documented better than anyone else in the world, and irrefutably so. But Hitler, although he's German, is not a Leibnizian, thank God. He's applauding Newtonian. Straightforward military power. He cannot see how quickly the calculus values of power and industry and warships can transform and grow and accelerate and exponentially accelerate and change. He knows nothing about rates of growth and transformation. So the transformation of the United States Navy into the awesome force it becomes by 1943 is beyond Hitler. But that's why he goes to war and gets FDR off the hook. And as a result, we do not remember Dean Acheson as the architect of catastrophe, which he was in 3 separate wars. Provoking Japan to war in 1941, when it was unavoidable and unnecessary and the Japanese were not looking for it. Provoking North Korea to war against the United States because he falsely sets up South Korea as a soft target. And it's not because he wants to provoke a war in Asia. It's because he's too stupid and incompetent to realize what he's doing. And then, of course, when all the American veterans of World War II, all the great American leaders, Eisenhower, Bradley, even MacArthur, Joe Collins, the great commander who fought in Guadalcanal and then smashed the Nazis in Normandy, are all warning and advising against going into Vietnam. It's not a war we can win. It's not a war that plays to our strengths. It's a war where we will have futile failure. All the great American commanders, including General Bradley himself, are warning against this. And even MacArthur is on the right page of sanity at the time. No. Gung-ho Dean Acheson, a man who never saw war at first hand, who had no combat experience, who had no professional military expertise, who never listened to or respected any serious general from MacArthur to Bradley. No, he's the one who says, we must be strong and macho. We're Democrats. We're more macho than the Republicans are. Duh. He's another, what Gore Vidal rightly calls Teddy Roosevelt, he's another contemptible little sissy, setting himself up as a macho racist warmonger. If Hitler, God forbid, had ever come to America, Dean Acheson would have rallied to his side. And of course, clearly you've gone into this more than me, Magdalena, because I see the understanding, the deep understanding in your eyes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. I mean, I think you sort of addressed a lot of the questions that I've seen coming in pertaining to Pearl Harbor. I know once upon a time, you had mentioned to me, Marty, something to do, and I never quite internalized it. I feel bad. I didn't do the work. I didn't read the book. And I forgot the name of the book, actually, where you had cited once that there had been information that British intelligence had acquired through their Australian, I guess, signals office that they'd intercepted and decrypted certain messages indicating some sufficiently advanced forenotice that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. Churchill withheld it. I believe you had mentioned in a previous discussion we had a long time ago. He consciously withheld it in order to create the catalyzer for the U.S. to come and bail out the failing British Empire. Could you maybe correct me if I'm wrong in my memory, or maybe add to it if I am correct, and expand upon that a bit?
Even if you are wrong, we are close enough friends, and I owe you so much, I would never say so. But of course, inevitably, I'm terrified. You and Cynthia are never wrong. And neither is Magdalena or Jerry or Stephen. Or Anton. I mean, you're just not. You all come from very different philosophical positions than I do. We all come from different backgrounds, but we all end up in the same place. I will take a minute or two later, possibly even to put the book on screen and display it to you, because I forget the exact name of the author, but anyone can look it up while we're talking. The book is called The Trail at Pearl Harbor. It came out more than 35 years ago, I think in 1990, possibly a year or two later. From Manaka, from the look on your face, you're already looking it up and ahead of us all as we speak, as usual. It was written by the officer who decoded the information and sent it to London himself. He was the lieutenant commander in the Australian Navy Reserve, serving in the Australian Navy. He was at Singapore. They had decoded JNS 25 itself, the key Japanese naval code. They knew where the Japanese strike fleet of 6 carriers and task force was going. They knew it was going to attack Pearl Harbor. They knew it was going to strike Pearl Harbor. They very properly informed the Admiralty in London. They were patriotic and honourable men, loyal to Australia, loyal as they understood it at the time to the British Empire in the best way, loyal to the United States of America, who they admired enormously and continued to for the rest of their lives. It was only many years later, because of course the fog, they simply assumed, they had to assume, they had no reason for not assuming, America had been warned, the information had been sent on, and the attack took Pearl Harbor by surprise anyway. It was not sent on, and this is all documented in the book. Churchill sat on the information. And we know he did because of the elaborate charade he personally carried out that very night. The very night of the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the attack was due, he invites the new pro-British American ambassador to Britain in London at the time, who has already started an affair with Churchill's own daughter-in-law, who what's her name? Harriman's wife, Pamela Harriman, right? Who has married Winston's son, Randolph Churchill, and is already two-timing on him, and has already embarked on love affairs with. Later, she will embark on one with Harriman, who she later marries and inherits his vast wealth in later age, and she lives long enough to be Bill Clinton's ambassador to France and Paris. She dies peacefully of a heart attack swimming in her private pool at the embassy in the middle of the 1990s. She has extraordinary longevity. She's in the middle of Western world history for more than half a century. Churchill does not tell his son, but she is now having an affair with America's ambassador to London. Look up his name. He's Joe Kennedy's successor, a sweet, honorable, innocent man who later commits suicide when Pamela Harriman drops him, when he is no longer ambassador to London, and she and Winston and the British Empire no longer need him anymore, right? But the ambassador is invited as Churchill's house guest to Chequers, the country estate of the English prime ministers, which Churchill is using correctly so at the time. And Churchill sets up an extraordinary, carefully orchestrated theatrical event. Churchill never bothers listening to the news on the radio, ever, at weekends. He gets his news from the British tabloid press. Right? But he suggests this night, let's have the wireless brought in by the butler and hear what's happening in the world. He the BBC to be carrying the account of the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And he wants to impress the American ambassador to Britain immediately on this. Imagine his consternation when there is no reference to any attack having happened. Right? But then at the end of the news, the BBC, innocent for once, gets the Prime Minister, but efficient at the time. Churchill's own illegitimate son, Brendan Bracken, is directing the BBC as Britain's Minister of Information at the time. You will not find a single reference in any British historiography whatsoever to these events. And you will not find a single mention in British historiography to the fact that Brendan Bracken was the illegitimate son of Churchill, even though this was openly known and discussed and common knowledge among all the members of Parliament and Churchill's supporters as well as his bitter enemies at the time. Or Butler, who was Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs under Chamberlain, who becomes Churchill's Minister of Education, and later becomes Finance Minister of Britain, Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1950s, one of the most eminent figures in British political history, who does not become Prime Minister, partly because of Churchill's opposition, with good reason, for other reasons to it, but he openly jokes about Churchill's bastard son at the time. Right? And yet there is no reference to this anywhere. And yet you cannot understand Churchill's behaviour, the mistrust of Churchill, or the way Churchill effectively wields power without realising that he chooses his own son to be his own version of Joseph Goebbels, his own propaganda chief, his own director of information and director of news through all of World War II. Brendan Bracken. Look up this man. He's a very significant and interesting figure. And he's worth a lecture, a seminar, and yet another seminar from me by himself on future occasions for what he reveals about Churchill, for what he reveals about the working of the British BBC, for what he reveals about the working of British government and the exercise of real power in the world. But at the end of this fateful broadcast, there is a reference after all. Reports are just coming in. The BBC announcer, a genuine innocent, a pawn in this game, says on the radio from London to Churchill's without enormous limitless relief, there are reports of some kind of Japanese aircraft actually attacking American installations in Hawaii. Reports are still vague and confused, which they were. Yet Churchill doesn't believe they are vague and confused. Oh, we must get onto the phone immediately to the president and tell him of our support in this situation. And on the basis of vague and unconfirmed reports, and nobody knows what has actually happened, Churchill calls up President Roosevelt immediately with the American ambassador present and said, "What is this we hear about this grave assault against all human nature and dignity and international law and against the sacred sovereignty of the United States of America, this outrage the Japanese have committed." He doesn't know what the Japanese have done. There's only been a vague reference, accurately and honestly reported by BBC Radio News. Details have not come in. America is still in confusion on this. Of course, we will be with you on this, Franklin. We will be with you to the bitter end. He's already foreseeing a full-scale world war against Japan. And, of course, Germany will be included as well. It stands to be said. He doesn't even say it to the president yet on this occasion. But on the basis of a few vague words, with the American ambassador already present, and in the book Betrayal at Pearl Harbor, writing 50 years after the event, before he dies because he is determined to set the record straight, the Australian officer who had broken JNS 25 and sent the crucial warning to London, and is appalled and puzzled all his life that the warning was never passed on to the President of the United States or to the United States Navy. Now, there are other bungles involved, because U.S. intelligence in Hawaii had not gone as far as the British had in Singapore in interpreting the signals. And there are reasons for this, because the Japanese strike force sails and at first is operating within the inland sea of Japan, and it is easier to receive short-wave signals bouncing wildly off the ionosphere down in Singapore than it is all the way at the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor. But Captain Rushfort's brilliant team of cryptographers in Pearl Harbor have decoded enough of Japanese radio traffic to believe the Japanese fleet is at sea. They don't know where it's going, but Pearl Harbor is a possibility. But the captain in charge of naval intelligence is simply a repulsive fucking idiot who is later responsible for two of the largest American naval disasters in the battles for Guadalcanal. And he is also a personal favorite of Admiral Herney King, who is about to replace Admiral Harold Stark as Director of Naval Operations for the United States Navy. So he is able to cover up his own culpable ignorance, which is not as bad as what Churchill did, but is still bad as enough. So later American conspiracy theorists like the pseudo-historian John Holland come along, and they're paranoid against FDR, and they hate FDR like poison. And they see there is enough evidence of some kind of paper trail being covered up over warnings in the United States naval intelligence, and they therefore assume that FDR sat on the information and buried it himself. No, there is absolutely no evidence in the archives or from eyewitnesses, no evidence whatsoever that FDR knew of the intervention in advance or dreamed it was going to happen. There is also culpable negligence on the, though again, well-meaning on the part of General Marshall. General Marshall recognizes talks are going toward. General Marshall and Stark and the president openly discuss the fact that the talks are clearly heading for deadlock. Nobody is quite sure where all the Japanese Navy is. There are clearly signs the Japanese are going to use the breakdown of talks to attack British and French and Dutch colonies in East Asia for the raw resources. The threat of this is recognized. And therefore, telegrams are sent to the Admiral commanding and General commanding in Pearl Harbor and to MacArthur, the great saint of the Republicans, who the conspiracy theorists all love. But they are totally taken by surprise too, because they have a racist underestimation of the Japanese, as does Churchill. And this is the key to the whole business, because Churchill is not cunningly plotting the sinking of the Pacific Fleet. He does not imagine it can possibly happen. He does not imagine that the Japanese Army Air Force operating, how far is it? I think it's 4,000 miles, but maybe it is less, but certainly operating thousands of miles from home, from bases, not even with aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Siam, but operating from bases in Southeast Asia, that the Japanese Naval Air Force can possibly sink Royal Navy battleships at sea. Churchill is a bigger racist than Rudyard Kipling or Teddy Roosevelt or Dean Acheson. He saw Japanese diplomats being polite and charming. He thought they were, at the Versailles Peace Conference, they were all dressed in spats, in morning suits, in top hats. They all had buck teeth. They all had large glasses. They all seemed to be short-sighted. And they all seemed to be ridiculous. They all spoke English with a ridiculous Japanese accent. So, of course, they must be stupid. And their navy must be stupid. Because they're not Anglo-Saxon, are they? They're not the master race. The Germans, at least, are worthy of respect. But the Japanese are not. Like the Chinese and Indians, they can be treated with boundless contempt. Now, Billy Hughes in Australia, who was a racist, but who lived dealing with the Japanese, and who had seen Japanese battleships in Sydney Harbour and Melbourne Harbour, and who sees the flood of high-quality Japanese industrial exports into Australia at the time, and who sees the appetite the Australians already have for Australian meat exports, that they cannot raise themselves, that they have not the planes and resources to do so. Billy Hughes did take the Japanese people and their government and their navy very seriously indeed. But Churchill did not. Churchill believed that in letting the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, he was convinced no harm would be done. They'd all be shot down. They're all incompetent. They can't see straight. And the only way to sink a battleship, Churchill is still convinced from the air, is to drop a bomb down its funnel. William Manchester, an admiring, uncritical biographer of Churchill, but nevertheless far better than my old friend and teacher, Sir Martin Gilbert, who did worship Churchill totally blindly. But William Manchester documents that Churchill is convinced that no battleship can be sunk from the air by hostile action by the Germans, let alone by the Japanese, unless you manage to drop a bomb straight down its funnel. That is the kind of ignorant asshole that the man who served twice as political head of the Royal Navy, as First Lord of the Admiralty on two separate occasions at the start of both world wars, actually believes. So, of course, he lets the American Navy be taken by surprise at Pearl Harbor. And, of course, he is astonished that the American Navy is sunk. And even then, he believes the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse will single-handedly either deter the Japanese from daring to attack Malaya or Singapore, or the great 15-inch guns of the Repulse and the 14-inch guns of the Prince of Wales, which actually kept jamming, which were useless. Right? Of course they will stop it. And Churchill had sailed on the Prince of Wales itself to impress President Roosevelt when they signed the Atlantic Charter in August 1941. President Roosevelt only comes to the war in a cruiser, the Augusta, but Churchill is on board a 35,000-ton battleship. So impressive. And when he sends the Prince of Wales with the repulse battlecruiser out to Singapore to deter the Japanese, what is his words of wisdom to this neophyte at war, this ignoramus, this innocent Franklin Roosevelt? There is great comfort in being able to send out something that is bigger and faster and tougher and stronger, that can sink anyone at sight, as we have done. To paraphrase slightly, but look up the quote. The quote is true to this and is revealing as the Prince of Wales. The Japanese Naval Air Service sinks the Prince of Wales and the Repulse in 2 hours. It's easy shooting for them. The Prince of Wales sinks first. It's badly designed, like all the British battleships in the 1930s. Right? It's easily damaged. It's fire control. It's rendered helpless within half an hour of the attack first starting. The Repulse puts up a much more impressive fight. And incidentally, the Repulse also has extraordinary resonance in history, because the captain of the Repulse, Captain Leach, one of the outstanding commanders of the British Navy at the time, goes down and dies with his ship. Previously, Churchill had tried to court-martial him for cowardness, because after the HMS Hood blows up in the hands of the Bismarck and the Prince of Wales is seriously damaged and its gun turrets are jammed through appalling British workmanship and even worse design, just like the Titanic, you will remember, which I discussed in the previous seminar, familiar tale. Captain Leach saves his crew and saves the ship and saves Churchill's worthless hide by withdrawing under smoke. And Churchill tries to court-martial him for cowardness. And the head of the British Home Fleet, the immediate successor, one of the great British fighting admirals, Admiral Sir John Toby, who does succeed in sinking the Bismarck only 3 days later, tells Churchill he will not allow the court-martial of Captain Leach to go ahead. And if Churchill does, Admiral Toby, will resign in outrage at Churchill's action and will appear in Captain Leach's defense, because Captain Leach had acted in the finest traditions and courage and finest judgment of the fighting tradition of Britain's Royal Navy. And only then Churchill backs down. But of course, he never, being the petty little bag of shit he really truly is, he never forgives a humiliation or being proven wrong when he was wrong. He never forgives. He's petty, and he never appoints Admiral Toby to another major command again. That's the kind of man he is. But there is another resonance 40 years later, when Argentina occupies the Falkland Islands. And Argentina is an ugly American-backed military dictatorship that has slaughtered 35,000 innocent people at the time, usually again after torturing them to death. Margaret Thatcher, although the Falkland Islands are in the middle of nowhere and there's only a few English sheep farmers on them, does not take that kind of treatment lying down from anyone. So she goes to full-scale war against Argentina, even when Ronald Reagan tries to talk her out of it. Because Reagan and Jeane Kirkpatrick, his ambassador to the UN, don't care that Argentina is a racist dictatorship that tortures innocent social democrats to death. They don't care about that at all. They're an ally against communists. That's all they care about, right? But Thatcher takes no shit, right? But who supports her in this? The former head of the Royal Navy, a 5-star admiral of the fleet, Admiral Leach, who is the son of his beloved father, who fought the Bismarck, who defied Churchill, and who died as a result of Churchill's criminally incompetent bungles when he commanded the Prince of Wales when it was sunk by the Japanese Navy in 1942, Admiral Leach. Again, 40 years afterwards, world events happen as a direct result of previous events and bungles and heroic events happening 40 years before. And it is only 50 years after Pearl Harbor that the book Betrayal at Pearl Harbor is published. And it is published in America. It is published in Australia. I think it is published in Britain. But it is ignored in Britain and by American historiography to this day. because the god King Churchill is exposed as having stabbed America and the US Navy and the Pacific Fleet in the back, and even worse, of being a criminally incompetent bungler who sent 3,000 American boys to their deaths at Pearl Harbor, and who incidentally, as a byproduct, nearly killed my father-in-law long before my wife was born at the time as well, right? This is the kind of man Churchill was. But the myth that he is this great war genius is now, of course, leading us into world war with NATO against Russia. We must listen to what the Prophet Churchill said about Munich, because everything the Prophet Churchill said was always true. And Churchill was courageous, and Churchill was strong, and Churchill always won. And Churchill was always right. Well, no, he went to the bathroom as will the rest of us. And yes, he was right, though, for utterly different reasons, which is there is an untold story about Munich, which is that the Czechs never fought and were cowards and were never going to fight, because that was their historical record before it and afterwards as well. The Slovak people were brave and fought. The Slovak people have a magnificent military tradition. 50,000 Slovaks died against the Nazis, opening the Carpathian Mountains passes, which were otherwise impossible for the Red Army in 1944. There was not a single Czech among them. What was the Czech contribution to World War II en passant? And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. They built 20,000 Messerschmitt 109 fighters for the Luftwaffe. They built twice as many Luftwaffe fighters, MA-109s, as the Messerschmitt Company in Bavaria did itself. All of this is documented. All of this is on the record. All of this is there. But nobody wants to see it. It doesn't even have to be covered up. Nobody wants to admit it. It is an inconvenient fact. Or as Charles Fort said, it is a damned fact. A fact that must be damned because, as all of you here in this audience, in this seminar, as I too separately, we have all been damned because we recognized inconvenient facts in history and in current affairs. But the book is called Betrayal at Pearl Harbor. Shall I go and bring it over and display it to the screen?
No, I'm gonna. Magdalena shared it already, and I'm going.
Good, excellent.
Yeah, I'm going to put it in the description box under this video when it is up online as well, so that people watching this on YouTube can go and buy that book immediately after they've heard you. And I'm also probably going to make this a standalone video. I think this little like 20-minute exposition.
Fine.
I think I like that. I want to put that on record and make it more observable for people, because it's a very important point of contention about, like, what did Roosevelt do? Pearl Harbor is a 9/11 or whatever. That's a big thing. So I love how you just clarified the terms, the nuance very, very effectively. That book also, I'm going to buy it right now. And thank you, Marty, for doing what you just did there. Really, really do appreciate that immensely. I figure we have probably time for 3 more questions, if that's okay with you, Marty. Do you have time for 3 more questions?
Oh, as long as you like, absolutely.
As long as I like. Well, I could.
Well, or at least until I am pulled away by by those to whom I must obey, which is family and not political. But there you go.
Yeah, I'm assuming nature has its forces too that are pulling on you as well. So I
well, no, in that one side talk, it's like the Hulk getting into a battle. The more Hulk fights, the stronger Hulk grows. The more I talk, the more I will continue to talk. You know, it's like a perpetual motion machine.
All right, I can work with that. All right, so we got Peter has been waiting to share a thought. We got Scott and we got Jerry. So let's do those 3, and we'll see where we go from there. Peter.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Thank you again, Martin. I missed a chunk of the lecture on account of having to do some law office work in the midst of the lecture. So I hope my question doesn't overlap something that you already covered. But your comments on the Falklands prompted me to ask a follow-on question. Because when the Falklands took place, I was a first-class midshipman at Annapolis, and I made the acquaintance of exchange midshipmen from Greenwich. So the question is, how much better off would the United States have been had General Stilwell's position on China prevailed over Chennault and Acheson? And the follow-up question on the Falklands was there a plan in place to lend lease an American amphibious helicopter carrier, the Iwo Jima or the Guam, in case the HMS Ark Royal was lost in the Falklands War?
Oh, I don't know about the Falklands Plan. I don't think so. The American attitude on the Falklands was General Haig was Secretary of State at the time, and he loved the Argentinians. And it's perfectly true that Mrs. Thatcher wanted good business with the Argentinians before and really didn't care that they were doing on a much grander scale to the Social Democrats, anyone independently minded in Argentina, which she would have loved to have done to the Irish Republican movement in Ireland and to the IRA on a grand scale. And that's absolutely correct. The Argentinians were not just murderous thugs, they were stupid murderous thugs. Thatcher was in their corner. It took real effort on their part to make a mortal enemy of her. They were that stupid. You find similar parallels with Hitler and certainly with Netanyahu and others too. It took incredible stupidity with LBJ and company and McNamara to make enemies of the Vietnamese. In World War II, the Viet Minh, as they still then were, and they were already a strongly communist movement, but they were also very anti-Japanese, and they saved more American aircraftmen's lives than even the Yugoslav resistance and the French resistance did in World War II. Now, the French resistance and the Yugoslav resistance were outstanding, and they were real friends and allies of ours. But so were the Vietnamese. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh celebrates the independence of Vietnam, which Franklin Roosevelt was determined to uphold had he lived. And how is this celebrated? By reading the U.S. Declaration of Independence to a crowd of 1 million people in Hanoi, right after the Japanese surrender in 1945. So it took enormous incompetence, 20 years of American stupidity and incompetence backing up the corrupt and failing French and British empires in East Asia to provoke America into the utterly unnecessary Vietnam War. And of course, Dean Acheson, who loved the British Empire, who loved being an English gentleman, was behind all of this all the way. As to Stilwell, no. One often comes to depressing situations in history. We see it again now with Trump replacing Biden, where someone totally repulsive is replaced by somebody who may be an improvement, but is still a walking disaster area and messes up things they shouldn't be. Again, Jenny, clearly you were light years ahead of me in this. We must talk on about this. And I owe you, I don't know how many replies. I'll try to get at least a passable one to you in the next week or three. My apologies as usual. Life has its endless demands, but it's still better than the alternative. But if you're looking at Stilwell is part of the American delusion. He's like General Gordon was of Khartoum a century before. The poor, helpless, virgin, innocent, lovable little Chinese are helpless by themselves. They need a white Anglo-Saxon master to pat them on the head and protect them from liberals and bankers. And of course, in Stilwell's case, Jews, he's very, very anti-Semitic. He's very anti-British too. Now, while that can be admirable in some respects, Stilwell does not have any of the admirable aspects, only the appalling ones. He's a know-nothing, ignorant racist who General Marshall, very revealingly, thinks the world of. He thinks Stilwell is a military genius. Now, Stilwell has, Chennault is even worse. Chennault is involved as, I have to read much more in this. Cynthia and you, Matt, of course, have done major work in this. Chennault is up to his head in organized crime, human trafficking, and most of all, the drug trade. And most of all, he's very much like Pete Hegseth, our current Secretary of Defense. He's a big-mouthed asshole amateur who thinks he knows everything and knows SFA, knows sweet expletive deleted nothing. He's a military. This is Chennault. He thinks you can send American B-29 bombers to China and they'll bomb the heart out of Japan. But there is no infrastructure in China, and there's no way it can be built. And China is sunk in enormous poverty. And a handful of B-29 bombers are sent, and they keep breaking down. But they piss off the Japanese enough that they launch the only successful land offensive they manage in 3 years of war after their first offensives peter out in the spring of 1942, and they don't have the capability to do more. But in China, they enslaved untold tens of millions more Chinese, driving to conquer the American bases that Chennault has guaranteed can win the war on the cheap. FDR makes mistakes, especially on China. He's totally ignorant on China. He means well for the Chinese people, but he has a guilt complex because the Delano wealth was made on selling opium to China 50 and 80 years before, in China in the 19th century anyway. So a guilty conscience often makes for very bad policy. And that's FDR's policy on China. Churchill can run rings around him on China because the British at least recognized Chiang Kai-shek for being the totally corrupt, ghastly joke that sinister little gangster that he is. The most popular radio show in Britain through World War II. And notice Churchill's son, Britain's Goebbels, Brendan Brecken, allows this show to be broadcast through all of World War II, is a satirical comedy show called ITMA, ITMA, which is short for the phrase, "It's that man again." And it's actually a pioneer version of Monty Python. Same kind of humor, same kind of absurdist jokes, same fearlessness. And it's allowed on the air, and the British people love it through World War II. But one of the most popular characters in the show is a Chinese general modeled on Chiang Kai-shek. Instead of Chiang Kai-shek, he's called Cash My Check. Cash my check, because he's totally corruptible and corrupt and stupid and absurd and corrupt. And even Winston Churchill, allows this to be broadcast on the British Broadcasting Corporation to 20 million eager listeners in Britain. It's the most popular show in Britain, and it's third throughout the British Empire too. I believe it's broadcast in Canada at the time as well, and certainly in Australia. And that's everybody's opinion of Chiang Kai-shek. And it's true. Now, it's also General Stilwell's opinion on Chiang Kai-shek. He calls General Chiang Kai-shek the peanut because he looks like a peanut. He's the same color, and Stilwell is racist as all hell. He's got a golden complexion, and he has a bald head shaped exactly the shape of a peanut. So Stilwell calls the Generalissimo of China, the leader of one of the four great powers supposedly in the world, the peanut. And in terms of his estimation of the military capabilities of China, this is true. But the best divisions which China has, or which Chiang is too wily to send his best forces to be controlled by Stilwell. Stilwell finally gets a real command out of his boyhood friend, but there's nothing improper between them, but they're just lifelong best pals and buddies, General Marshall. So after General, what's his name? Bolivar something or other, his grandfather is killed in action against the Japanese in Okinawa in 1945, because the general is such an idiot, he doesn't realize the Japanese can hit him with a machine gun, that he's within range, even though everyone around him is telling him to get his full head down. He gets himself killed unnecessarily. So an opening comes up in the top command, and Stilwell is put in charge of the U.S. Army in Okinawa. And it's the only time he has any kind of field or operational command in the war. And of course, he doesn't have a clue. Against the Germans, he'd be ground beef. And even against the Japanese, he's hopeless, but the Japanese position by now in Okinawa is hopeless anyway. so he doesn't kill too many people unnecessarily while he's there. And he's already dying of some kind of stomach cancer or colon cancer at the time. No, I can't remember. It's already been diagnosed. I think it's only diagnosed after he goes back to America afterwards. He's been too stupid and too quote unquote tough to get any regular military checkup. So by the time the cancer is diagnosed correctly, it's too soon to do anything even to slow down the progress of it. But as a general, Stilwell is hopeless. But Chanot is even more hopeless. FDR and the American Air Force, Army Air Force generals have delusions that China can count in the war. But it's based on, again, it's more American ignorant idiots, which we still see today, invested with the power of gods, messing up everything they touch. So Stilwell is vastly overrated. And you must remember his reputation is based on the book by an exceptional idiot, but a very well-connected one, Barbara Tuchman, who herself comes from a background of privilege. She is wealthy German New York Jewish intellectual, an early Bryn Mawr champion of women's rights. She is very talented. She writes beautiful narrative histories. The only trouble is they're all fiction. If you read them as More Pearl Buck, you can enjoy them and do well. But she gets everything she touches wrong. She gets the start of World War I wrong, because she believes that German orders to invade through Belgium she actually saves the world through her stupidity. Because her book, The Guns of August, says World War I began because the Kaiser could not reverse, and General Field Marshal von Moltke cannot attack France except through Belgium. The timetables of mobilization for the German army are set in stone. And as Moltke said to the Kaiser, if you change the plan to invade France through Belgium, then Germany will be destroyed, right? Because in chaos. That's what Moltke did tell the Kaiser. He did. And Tuchman rightly reports this correctly. And A.J.P. Taylor, another legendary historian who's a useless piece of fraud and shit, right, who was still a big name in Oxford in my day, though I never interacted with him personally. But I sat in a couple of his lectures, and he was a ridiculous little man. And that's all he should really be remembered for. But of course, he's revered as an Oxford professor. But the real truth is, as later historians discovered, and as the great American military analyst, thankfully still very much with us, William S. Lind, repeatedly pointed out and taught me 25 years ago personally. And Bill was a very good friend. He's retired now in Cleveland, never goes on email, so we're out of direct touch. But he was a wise and good and brilliant man. The German general staff of before World War I, who Bill greatly admired, he doesn't believe in reincarnation, but I believe in it as a general principle, and I'm convinced Bill was in the German general staff before World War I as a fine and honourable and sophisticated officer, because he has all the tastes and intellectual distinction and even prejudices as well of a genuinely honourable German officer of that generation. But Bill points out the German general staff before World War I was the finest, most professional in the world, and they really were thorough, unlike the Pentagon today. And they actually did have operational plans to avoid war with Britain and avoid invading Belgium and carrying out the Schlieffen Plan by bypassing Belgium. You never see this in any of the histories because they're all based on Tuchman and the myth. But the plans existed. So what happened? Moltke was panic-stricken and either forgot them in his hysteria or was so stupid that he'd never known them in the first place. And the Kaiser himself, who wrongly has a reputation which Bill shares as being a wise and thoughtful guy. No, he wasn't. He was a fuckhead. Forgive the language, but he really was. Occam's razor. He really was a fuckhead. It never occurred to either the most eminent soldier in the world, von Moltke, or the warlord of Imperial Germany, who devoted his life to the study of war, der Kaiser, the all-highest, to pick up a telephone and call the general staff and ask them, excuse me, but do we have a provisional plan to carry out the Schlieffen Plan to invade France on the French left flank, on the west wing, without invading Belgium and bringing Britain and the British Empire into war against us, because the British have said they'll stay out if we respect Belgian neutrality. It never occurred to him to pick up the telephone, which they, of course, did in Berlin in 1914, especially in imperial headquarters, and call their military headquarters in the same city and say, can you check the files? Can we switch the mobilization? Can we switch the plan from one route to another? It never occurred to the Kaiser or his top military officer and professional advisor to pick up a telephone and ask and check. And that's why Britain entered the war, and West Germany and Britain alike and Western civilization were destroyed, and why the Russian Revolution happened. Because neither of the people at the top, when they were in the lock of blind panic and their own infernal ignorance, thought to pick up a phone and call their own headquarters. And Churchill in 1914, either a separate lecture for future matter, make another mini broadcast out of this one, why don't you? Churchill did the same screw up for the British Empire. Because even if Belgium was occupied by the Germans, it didn't matter to the British. It was no threat to them. The Belgian ports were a mortal threat to Britain in the days of sailing ships or low-tech short-range steam battleships that couldn't stay at sea long. Because if you had the German fleet deployed in Belgium, then the British had to deploy their whole navy against them. But Churchill himself had made this threat obsolete. He had switched the British Navy to oil-powered turbine-engine battleships, which had much longer range and duration at sea. And he had based them more safely way up to the north in the islands of the Outer Hebrides at a place called Scapa Flow, where they could stop the German Navy breaking into the Atlantic Ocean and bottle them up. And Churchill himself was ignorant of the implications of his own strategic plan and did not consult his own admirals. So the British could have ignored a 75-year-old obsolete treaty and not gone to war in Germany and not lost 1 million dead immediately, 2 million more crippled and who died 30 and 40 years before their time from war injuries as a direct result of the war. And he himself had made that treaty obsolete. And again, there is relevance for us today, 110 and more years later. Because the Treaty of London, which guaranteed benefits for the British Empire, in 1839, was 75 years old in 1914, and it was obsolete. It was dead on its feet. It was irrelevant to the needs and security of the modern world, of the British themselves. But what do we see today? We see NATO, the Treaty of Washington, 1949, already more than 75 years old itself. And is it relevant to the very different world we see today? No, of course it is not. Yet Britain and France are charging towards nuclear annihilation in a war they do not need to threaten against Russia, which Russia sees as a need for existential survival, right, under the banner head of NATO. And the United States, even under Trump, they still believe Article 5 of NATO, of the original treaty, has binding power, so that America, the United States and Canada must go to thermonuclear confrontation and see their great cities destroyed by Russian attack or preemptive attack or counterattack. Why? That was I had a great teacher, another great teacher at Oxford, who was master of my college, Exeter College. Not one of the most prestigious colleges, but a pretty good one as far as I'm concerned, an outstandingly good one. And there was wonderful historian Greg Barr, who'd been a senior and honourable British officer serving in the Far East in World War II and after World War II, when Greg was still only in his 20s. And he always asked, when people trotted out cliches about the Civil War, or World War One, or World War Two, or why we had to do this, or why we had to do that, he would simply ask, why? Was it really necessary? Was it really necessary for Britain to hang on in India the way Churchill wanted to? Churchill predicted India would collapse in chaos and barbarism as soon as the kindly, understanding British Empire was withdrawn. Well, over the past 78 years now, has that happened? There are twice as many people, no, I think 3 times as many people in India today as there were in the 1930s. The standard of living per capita of the Indian people today is exponentially, infinitely higher than it ever was under the kindly, understanding, tolerant British Empire. Is it not? Are the Chinese people more hooked on opium today than they were when Britain controlled all the ports and customs and external trade of China so they could pump unlimited opium into China? Exactly the same kind, understanding, protective terms, by the way, that Britain has now extended to Ukraine under Zelensky, under the secret accords which the Ukrainians have already leaked, to the 100-year treaty they only signed this year to quote-unquote protect Ukraine from big, bad, evil Russia. Wow. The world is strangely better off without the British Empire looking after its affairs than it ever was with it, isn't it?
Amen. Amen to that. All right. So look, I think we got time for two more questions, and I know Scott's been waiting, Jerry's been waiting to throw both questions and comments out. So and I gotta say, Marty, you got this musicality about how you compose your thoughts, and it's just so enjoyable. I like your mind. Is what I'm trying to say. I enjoy your mind.
A life devoted to listening to Irish pub music when I couldn't create it myself.
Right
what can
on.
I say?
Well, that worked out. Cool. All right. So Scott and then Jerry. Scott, go now.
Hey, okay. Thanks, Matt. Great lecture, Marty, as always. Fantastic and engaging. And I just thought of a bit of the, and thanks for covering the Pearl Harbor fiasco for people to look at. That reminded me of the stuff, some of the information I studied. And since I remembered you are a Mexican expert history. You may know more about
he says he's not a Mexican expert.
Look, I have fraudulently been able to get away with this and endless seminars on Capitol Hill, but there's a reason for that. Because literally everybody in Washington is utterly ignorant of everything that you could learn in 5 minutes on Wikipedia on Mexican history. The level of ignorance on Mexico in Washington and New York is phenomenal. It is exponential. It is inconceivable.
Okay, that's Marty's way of saying yes, he isn't a Mexican expert, because in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and Marty has one eye, and he's done well. So, Scott, continue.
Okay. I remember reading about being astonished at how close we came from a British-funded Mexican fascist invasion of the southern United States. Had the Battle of Midway not been won, and principally, and just wondering if you knew much about that. I forget what the name of the groups were, but it has its legacy, I think, from the French occupation of Mexico that you probably covered in the 19th century. And so I that was a curious point. If you had something, and maybe that's a lecture, I don't know, that can be worked in. That's the other side of the various British Empire, fascism takeover. And just the other comment was about the Golden Gate Bridge, which is salient in Vancouver, where I'm here. We have the Lionsgate Bridge, both kind of their sister cities, San Francisco, Vancouver, and we too are a Asia Pacific city. And I just put in a link for Matt's paper on William Gilpin and his astonishing quote on the need for America to be have the influence of Chinese culture for it to survive. And so I thought that was pretty important for people to have a look at and very relevant for today. So I don't know if you've read that. You probably have. And any comments on that? Thanks.
Scott, first of all, please let us start talking bilaterally. And I've said this to other people in this group, and in each case, I'm not saying it from politeness. You are individually, apart from together, you are amazing talents and amazing resources. It's a joy to be meeting with you and interacting with you. And Scott, very selfishly and seriously, and I'm totally serious about this, I've never been to Vancouver, and I knew by reputation what a wonderful place it is. Wangle me a trip there or something. Even I vowed after a very fruitful but personally, physically risky trip to the Persian Gulf last December, not to go on such global jaunts again, except under careful supervision. But within the great North American continent, that's still in my range. So really, I'd love to do some visiting lectures or seminars with the excuse of something, just to be out visiting with you folks in Vancouver at some point. The American West Coast I know so well, but north of the border, on the West Coast, I've never been. But again, what you discuss here is not just one seminar, but a whole series of them. And several of them have already been done by Matt and Cynthia, and the rest of you in the series, and certainly by Jerry too. What would it have been? There are lots of books, people are fond of saying if Japan had occupied the United States. There's a wonderful book by Philip K. Dick on this. And they even made a remarkably good, lengthy TV series of it on cable a number of years ago. The Man in the High Castle is the book. If Japan and Germany had won the war and occupied the United States, it's hauntingly good, and it's metaphysically good. I mean, Philip K. Dick was a genius. Imagine if Kafka had wrote not 5 masterpieces, but 60 full-length novels, all of which were surrealistic masterpieces. And if Kafka had not only had unromantic relations with an unsatisfying one with a couple of prostitutes, but if he had been married and divorced 5 times, had endless one-night stands with girls out on one-day passes from the lunatic asylum near which he lived in Oakland, and if Kafka had imagined his teeth had been bugged by the CIA all his life, then Kafka would have been Philip K. Dick. Because Philip K. Dick was all these things, but he was also the most prolific and brilliant science fiction and even metaphysical genius in the history of American fiction. If you look at places where Poe opens doors and is never given a chance to go through them, imagine Dick plunging through all those doors and finding entire continents. But now we go back here. First of all, I think I've given before in the series, and maybe I haven't, but I've certainly given in lectures in Washington, the history. I did give a lecture here, and I believe it's online, and that is the history of British-French imperial plots to enslave Mexico. And this starts with Aaron Burr, and continues with the something I discussed even under Lord Palmerston, which is the British hijacking of the wealth and peoples of Latin America and the rape of them from the 1820s onwards, under the myths that democracy and free markets and free trade are being given to these people to raise them up to total happiness. It's exactly what I saw happening in front of my own eyes in Russia in the Yeltsin era. In the last decade of the 20th century. But afterwards, of course, it's also the reason why Palmerston, with Napoleon III as his eager swordsman, approves the establishing of a French-controlled puppet empire in Mexico under a well-meaning but utterly silly and naive and doomed Austrian Archduke Maximilian in the 1860s in Mexico. It's why Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant worked so decisively to reestablish the freedom of the Native American Mexican peoples in that brief decade of optimism and hope after the Civil War, the Reconstruction era. It's why Ulysses S. Grant, not Ulysses S. Grant, after he is forced out of office, why Rutherford B. Hayes, under the shameful compromise with the Dixiecrats and the Southern racists, also allows the big financial interests in London and Paris to impose a level of dictatorship that is Stalinist and Hitlerist in the level of its bloodbath and its repression under President Diaz for 36 years in Mexico, from 1876 all the way through to 1911. And it's the only way you can understand the genuine fear and the genuine, unsuppressible democratic impulse of the Mexican people to struggle repeatedly to re-establish and defend social democracy in Mexico to this day. It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. And the CIA involvement with the cartels and the hollowing out of democracy in Mexico from 1980 onwards, and the efforts we see today in Mexico to try and reestablish and defend social democracy, all of them have to be understood in the same overall context. So this is an enormous subject, and it is an enormous issue, and it has never gone away.
Thank you, Marty. Jerry, last question's yours, or thought/question is yours to deliver.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks, Martin. This is another wonderful tour de force of world history. But one thing you were talking about, Dean Acheson, that really got me, because I didn't know the story of this, as you call him, lunatic. But it just makes sense. But then the way you're describing Acheson, I'm going, he's still around today. His ideas are still there, because it reminded me of, I've been doing some reading of this guy, Elbridge Colby. He's the number 3 man in the Pentagon right now. And he wrote an article a couple of years ago. I mean, it wasn't his idea, but they're giving him credit for it. And he was saying, if China was to invade Taiwan, then the United States should bomb the factories in Taiwan, to bomb the silicon chip factories to make sure they don't get turned over to China. And I thought, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. You're going to tell Taiwan, we'll defend you by bombing your factories. But it just reminded me of the same lunacy of Dean Acheson. So I just wanted your comment on that, on comparing lunatics.
Jerry, we're old friends by now, thank God. You know very well by now, when you or Monty come out, or Jenny, whenever you come out, the more apparently outrageous the remark, the more it's going to be totally on target, and there's nothing I need to add to it. Again, fully agree with you. The one sign of optimism I'll give for the moment, and it's probably far too naive and optimistic, is from our perspective over here. Hegseth is such a clown, even by the extraordinary standards of Washington, which Juvenal in his satires in ancient Rome never conceived of anything on this scale. Couldn't have. But Hegseth is such a clown that even for the president, Hegseth appears to be unsustainable for more than a few days. Of course, having said that, if the world survives, he'll probably get the Presidential Medal of Honor after 20 years in his current position, when the rest of the world is rubble. But if there was anything sane left in the world, Hegseth should be gone, and therefore the awful clowns he's brought in should be gone with him. Even in the Pentagon, where the standards are not high, the horror and disbelief and disconnection with these people is impossible to exaggerate. I mean, Hegseth is a man who gave priority to making sure he had his own makeup room installed in the Pentagon. Now, no Secretary of Defense in history, however brilliant or however idiotic and abominable they have been, and they have been at both extremes, has ever conceived of that. But when you look at where Hegseth came from, and again, I did an article on this, which the Pluralia website in Italy published, and you should find it there. And if anyone needs a link to it, let me know directly, and I'll happily send it to you. But I did a demolition job on Hegseth when he came in. And I thought at the time, he then went to Europe for Trump and read a script which the Secretary of State Rubio, who does have actually some experience and has shown competence and responsibility, at least within the field, the very narrow field he's allowed to operate in, probably wrote for him. But I then thought, I regret writing that article. It was much too unkind. Of course, with everything Hegseth has done since, I was not remotely unkind enough. I described him as not having a brain, but simply having sand between his ears, and even worse than sand, the space between his ears was simply filled with 10-second sound bites. That was all he had ever done on Fox News. And I realized I was being much too fond of him on that occasion. The Fox people, I'm saying, of course, they're even more contemptible than they were in Ailes's day. I briefly appeared on them as a regular talking head during the first Bush administration. And there was a reason for this. They had me on in North Korea. Now, North Korea is an appalling regime. And they only let me speak for 5 seconds to 10 seconds at a time. It was not only sound bites, it was short sound bites. As long as they allowed me to say, well, of course, North Korea is repulsive, they would then shut me off and they would invite me back. But once I finally rose in Laura Ingraham's estimation so that she allowed me a 25-second sound bite, exactly, that was too much for them, and I've never been allowed back in the 21 years since, right?
25 seconds. Yes. And where's Matt?
Yep. Oh, Marty. Question. I noticed that Monty had a question that also was on my mind before we wrap it up, pertaining to Bergoglio, who just died, and Bergoglio's relationship to Operation Condor and the fascist Argentinian regime that he appears to have collaborated with in throwing a bunch of liberation theologian, fellow Jesuit, low-level priests under the bus to be tortured. And do you have any thoughts about Bergoglio's as a positive or negative force, and his relationship to fascist juntas run by the CIA back in the 70s, or what are your thoughts on that before we close it out?
I don't know much. It's a very gray area. From the little I know, I think he went along with them really as I did when I was in my 20s and early 30s, because we were both naive idiots. And the sense I've had of him since, and it may be wrong and it may be naive, and I am not an expert, not remotely, but is that he actually is a well-meaning man who actually came, not even a devil sick of sin, but just a well-meaning man who came to see that people who he had naively supported were absolute monsters. But that doesn't make him a hero. And I mean, you look at him on Gaza, I think it's very revealing on Gaza. Again, he means well to both the Israelis and the Palestinians, and somehow he messes it up at every point. He fights anti-Semitism around the world, which is admirable. And he condemns the non-stop bombing of Gaza, which is admirable, but he does so ineffectually and too little and too late.
Yeah. And
thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel better when I see you, Monty, and you, Jerry, nodding in appreciation. I feel when I'm on thin ice, or to see Jean Sebastian smile there, when I know I'm on thin and uncertain ice, it's a great relief to see people like you and you, Jenny, nodding at least sympathetically with me, recognizing the ice is thin. Exactly. So no. there was a line that's I mentioned before, this horrible torture killer in Belfast who I covered when I was very young and I was very junior, and I wasn't a hero of the coverage at all. The two great reporters who covered it, who even here I want to be witness to, were my dear friends then, and I hope still now, Martin Dillon, and who wrote The Shankill Butchers, and Jimmy Cusack, who became a senior editor on, I think, the Irish Press, the Irish News, no, the Irish Press newspaper down in Dublin. And but when this psychopath killer was finally killed, as I mentioned before, when he was buried, the funeral was an exercise. It was like, crying tears at the death of a Waffen SS war criminal, that kind of thing. And there was one quite obscure supporter of his. Remember, this is a guy who had personally tortured more than 40 people to death and participated in it. And someone said when he died, well, he wasn't the worst of them. He wasn't the worst of them, which of course makes you wonder, my God, what were the other ones like? And I can tell you what some of them were like. They were even worse than that. Exactly. Now, I don't mean that, God forbid for a moment, to imply that Pope Francis was a torture criminal. He was not. I believe he was a well-meaning man. But at least you can say about him, he wasn't the worst of them. Whatever bad he did, knowingly or unknowingly, or whatever good he failed to do, again, we're all human, he wasn't the worst of them. That doesn't mean he was the best of them either, but he wasn't the worst of them.
I like your diplomatic style, Marty. I'm trying to learn from it. I appreciate it.
Matt, look, I was going to say, if you have to learn diplomacy from me, you need lessons in diplomacy fast from real experts, I was going to say. Heaven help you if I'm the one you have to learn from.
You've somehow survived in the belly of the beast, so I'm definitely extracting what I can from you.
If I may, there is a line that came to me recently, and it sounds like a joke, but I actually mean it seriously, especially if you're in a city or near a Canadian or US air base that might be targeted for thermonuclear attack. And it's the first line the Ninth Doctor Who, along with Tom Baker, one of my great all-time favorites, said when the show was his first line when the show was revived in 2005. And maniac plastic dummies are running riots, slaughtering everyone in London, as no doubt they still are, right? The Doctor appears without warning, and he just looks like a disreputable, disheveled guy from the local pub. And he says to young teenage Rose, who will later become his traveling companion through time and space, I'm the Doctor. Run for your life. And that's the best secret to survival I learned on the streets of Belfast all those years ago. And it applies in politics too. And again, it sounds like a joke, but when you come up against it, you'll recognize it. To all of you, my genuine dear friends, know when to run for your life. Know when to run for your life. Yeah. Or smile and say yes. And look, again, getting to going forever. An old dear friend of mine, I think the world of him, very highly respected. We were friends in Oxford 50 years ago. She's a professor at an Israeli university. Now, I don't want to identify her more than that because she's outspoken in her courageous opposition to Netanyahu and his pathetic fascists who make even Mussolini look competent by comparison. But they're mean and nasty and vicious with all that, right? And she took me to task for being sweet and naive and loving about my assessment of President Putin. And I said, I'm not. You're the one who's naive. I do respect President Putin. I don't regard him as a Hitler, obviously. But President Putin is in charge of Soviet nuclear strategic forces. And he can press the button on the launch of several thousand of those weapons. And I learned a long time ago, as I said to my friend, you did not, that when you're up against repulsive little psychopaths in the streets of North Belfast, It pays to be polite to them. Your survival and that of your family and other loved ones may pay on giving them, being polite to them, and not playing sweet arse fucking games with them the way these ignorant, holier-than-thou human rights champions of freedom and democracy who never imagine their own lives or those of their entire nations are going to be put on the line will do. So if that's true, if you're dealing with a local ugly psychopath, if you're dealing with the leaders of major nations with thermonuclear arsenals at their disposal, all the more reason to treat them with respect. All the more reason to treat them with respect. And the fate of the world will ultimately hinge on the fact that we are surrounded by fuckheads, especially in London and Washington. And in this context, I pay no apology for returning to my Belfast fundamental vernacular. The fate of the world depends on that fundamental lesson. 2 lessons. First, know when to run for your lives, even from local threats. And remember, you don't have to have Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin after you, or the Duke of Edinburgh and the British Empire or Lord Palmerston. There can be very nasty little local threats much closer to home that if we have our eyes looking beyond the far horizon, we can miss all too easily. Know when to run for your life. And know when also, if there's just somebody who just has the power of life and death over your own neighborhood or your own city block or your own apartment building, know when to treat them with appropriate respect. That is very serious advice. Thank you.
Words of wisdom from Marty Sieff. I love it. No, thank you, Marty. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this wonderful Sunday explosion of ideas. This is great, Marty. We expect nothing less. You did great. And next week, we're going to have David Gosselin delivering something on classical poetry, the battle against Gnostic Satanists, and a lot of other good stuff. So it'll be Sunday, 2 p.m. Thank you, everybody, for sharing today.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, Marty.
Monty, wherever the hell you are, it looks like fun. Hope to join you.
Hey, wait a minute. You didn't say nothing. Hold on.
Yeah.
Exactly. It is fun. Oh, that looks wonderful.
All right. Mexican barbecue. Cool. Right
on.
Talk to you later, guys.
You got to have me down, man.
Yeah, but mi casa, su casa.
All right. Well, we might take you up on that. Be
Mi
careful.
casa, su casa.
All right.
Take it down.
See y'all. Bye.